The subcommittee will come to order. Today we're having a hearing on antibiotic resistance and the threat to public health, and I'll recognize myself initially for an opening statement. Today we're going to examine how we can best safeguard the effectiveness of antibiotics once they're on the market. We'll also explore how we can ensure the adequate development of new, safe, and effective antibiotics. Later this year, we expect to have a final hearing, essentially this is the second of 3 hearings, and the third or final hearing will be on antibiotic use in animal agriculture. As we discussed in our first hearing, antibiotics are among the most significant medical innovations of the 20th century. The CDC lists control over infectious disease as one of its top 10 great public health achievements of the last century and mentions antimicrobials as crucial to that accomplishment. Unfortunately, the potential of antimicrobials continues to be compromised. It's estimated that over 2 million people acquire bacterial infections in U.S. hospitals each year, and 90,000 die as a result of these infections. We should all be alarmed that at least 70% of these infections are resistant to at least one drug, and more bacteria are proving to be resistant to the antibiotics currently on the market. Unfortunately, these resistant diseases are among the most predominant illnesses in the population, including respiratory diseases such as pneumonia, food-related diseases including E. coli and Salmonella, and hospital-acquired infections commonly known as MRSA. As a matter of public health, it's imperative that we adopt a multi-pronged strategy to address antibiotic resistance. Today we'll examine how we can best safeguard the effectiveness of antibiotics once they're on the market. We probably all heard stories of physicians that have overprescribed antibiotics to people who may have viral instead of bacterial infections. And while they may do this to safeguard against an infection just in case, the overuse actually puts us all at risk. Patients also share blame. How many of us know someone that stopped taking their antibiotics once they felt better, even if they didn't finish the treatment? Our experts will also explore how we can ensure the adequate development of new, safe, and effective antibiotics on the market. It's a challenging situation because unlike some pharmaceuticals which are used to treat chronic illnesses, there is not a clear return on investment for antibiotics. Antibiotics are unique because not only are they used for short periods of time per illness, but the more they're used, the less effective they become. So in order to preserve their effectiveness, we as a society should all share the goal that they be used as rarely as possible. This is obviously not the business model that companies dream of, however, and I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses today, including government representatives from the FDA and BARDA, and also our private witnesses from the Infectious Disease Society of America, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and Cubist Pharmaceuticals. Cubist Pharmaceuticals. Okay. The witnesses will undoubtedly share key information related to our mutual goal of protecting the public from antibiotic resistance. And I'd like to now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Shimkus, and also thank you for your cooperation in putting this together today. I know it's not been easy for the last 24 hours, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we want to welcome our witnesses both in this panel and the next. And this is an important issue. This is one of the second in the series that we also feel is very important. Antimicrobial drugs have provided a tremendous benefit for the public health over the last half-century. In order to ensure it remains so, we must continue to promote appropriate and effective use and the uses we already have. Overuse and misuse can limit the effectiveness and make outright resistance grow even faster. The other half of the equation is research and development and product development, which I remain concerned over the prospect of new drugs coming online. We know the cupboard is almost bare, and of the limited drugs in development, most of it, not all, will never see approval. Any investment in antibiotics is not likely to match that of traditional drug development, and there remains an uncertain approval process when it comes to FDA. The FDA must continue to work on providing confidence and clarity so we can encourage the development of new antibiotics. And as I talked before the hearing, we all have great respect for the work that the FDA does, and it is the gold standard in the world. But many of us are concerned that we're asking you to do too much with limited resources. Those of us who aren't in the business of increasing resources would want to help you make the job more efficient and directive. That's why I've always been a risk-based person, that's where money should go, and we'll continue to work in that direction, but we do appreciate you being here. Mr. Chairman, I will be brief, but I'll also just raise my issue of the concern that we need a hearing on the new health care law. The President used yesterday his bully pulpit to talk about the benefits of the law. We still have yet to have a hearing on it, and I think it's probably time. If there are things the President thinks are important and is willing to go out to the American public to profess the benefits, we ought to be able to talk about those benefits here. We also should talk about some of the challenges. We did have our Republican Health Solutions Group meet, as I discussed in the last hearing. And during that hearing, Dr. Todd Williamson testified on behalf of the Coalition of State Medical and National Specialty Societies, representing more than 80,000 physicians from across the country. In his testimony, he said the most significant cost of the new health care law will be to our patients. They will suffer decreased access to the doctors and care they need. My sickest and most vulnerable patients will suffer the most because of a depleted pool of physicians, while the government continues to expand eligibility for its underfunded programs. In the state of Texas, 300 physicians have already stopped seeing Medicare patients over the last 2 years. Is Texas a snapshot of what's to come for the rest of the nation when 15% cuts go into effect? And when it comes to Medicaid, we know the situation is even worse for physicians, in some cases paying them 50% of what private insurance does. But the health reform law sets out to force millions of more Americans into Medicaid. We will face similar results when it comes to access and quality of care for patients. The state of Illinois is $12.8 billion in debt, and Medicaid already consumes 1/3 of the spending afford the increased cost of these new Medicaid populations. Just yesterday we had in the papers talked about nHealth, which sells HSA high deductibles to employers, recently announced it will terminate all its customers by December 31st, 2010, because it cannot survive the health care law mandates and regulations. Then there is American National Insurance Company, which similarly announced 2 subsidiaries, American National Life Insurance Company of Texas and Standard Life and Accident Insurance Company, won't sell health insurance to people in the individual market after June 30th, 2010 because of the health reform law. Can we really tell these people this? If you like what you have, you can keep it when these companies go out of the business, as the President promised to the American people. And it is only June of 2010. The full effects of this law won't go into effect until 2014. Are these problems only the tip of the iceberg? So once again, Chairman, I certainly have an appreciation for our hearing today, but we will continue to raise the health reform law and call on you for formal hearings to discuss the many issues, both positive, as the President promoted yesterday, and negative, these health insurance companies leaving the market, what is working and what needs to be addressed before it's fully implemented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. Our chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone, for calling this the second of a series of hearings that we're having on antibiotic resistance, which is a growing and dangerous threat to the public health, and it's an issue that deserves the full and complete attention of this committee. At our first hearing, we learned about the impact of antibiotic resistance on human health, and today we'll continue that discussion, but also focus on 2 important and directly related issues: the preservation of effective medicines that already make up our antibiotic drug arsenal, and the development of new antibiotics to fight resistant bugs. By definition, this is an inherently difficult goal to achieve. After all, the very use of antibiotics leads to the development of pathogens that can no longer be treated by those antibiotics. In this case, rather than use it or lose it, with antibiotics, it is use it and lose it. Already untold numbers of Americans die or are infected each year by antibiotic-resistant microbes. We pay a high price in other ways as well: additional hospital stays, hospital readmission, and increased doctor visits. These will add unnecessarily to the nation's annual health care bill. Our hearing in May made clear that it will take a multi-pronged approach to overcome this very serious and very present problem. Today, we will focus on two such strategies: a reduction in the inappropriate use of antibiotics and an expansion of the antibiotic product line and market. I believe that we must pursue both lines of attack. We simply must find ways to cut back on both the overuse and misuse of these drugs. At the same time, we need to ensure the existence of a market environment that encourages the development and commercialization of new, safe, and effective antibiotics to treat those pathogens resistant to existing antibiotics. Such an environment does not appear to be in place today. As we consider possibilities for market incentives, we must not lose sight of the potential impact those incentives may have on patients, especially if new antibiotics are more expensive than the patients can afford to buy. The written testimony we've already received lays out a variety of approaches to meet these objectives. I look forward to hearing more about them from our witnesses today. As we do, I hope we can continue to work on a bipartisan basis towards a public-private plan of action to address the overall and pressing antibiotic resistance problem that we now face. I thank the witnesses for their testimony and look forward to hearing from them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank the witnesses for being with us today on this very important subject. Certainly the American people are very much focused today on access to health care, quality of health care, as well as cost of health care. And the subject matter that we're going to discuss today is one very important component of that. It's already been stated that 2 million people roughly acquire infections in hospitals, and around 90,000 of those die each year. 70% of the hospital-acquired infections are caused by bacteria that are resistant to particular drugs most commonly used. We certainly understand that the process for developing clinical trials at the FDA is extremely complex, and we look forward to the testimony today to explore opportunities to make it less complex, but also ensuring safety. I know it's my understanding that there are about 15 antibiotics that are in the pipeline today at FDA for approval, and I'm not sure how I know this, but evidently we don't think there's much chance that many of those are going to be approved. But we do need to explore ways to provide incentives for pharmaceutical companies, as well as trying to make the system less complex, but also ensuring safety. And I'm delighted we're having this hearing and look forward to the testimony of all our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield.
Chairman, before you recognize
yes,
I just want to make a unanimous consent request, which I should have made. It's to put into the record a statement by Dr. Michael T. Flavin, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Advanced Life Sciences, prepared for the record for this committee.
I don't know if you've seen it, have you?
Yeah, we're fine.
You have? Okay. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And next is our Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearings on what is a growing and real public health crisis. 2 months ago, we had a hearing on the basics of antibiotic resistance, during which one of our witnesses, Dr. Thomas Frieden, Director of the Centers for Disease Control, stated that we're moving into a post-antibiotic world. He warned that there may be soon no clinical treatments for some infections. This is a very real and frightening crisis. Today, 19,000 people die a year of multi-drug resistant MRSA. Our soldiers are coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq with a Acinetobacter, which is often resistant to at least 3 classes of antibiotics. And hospital-acquired antibiotic-resistant infections cost our healthcare system up to $34 billion a year. Imagine what we're going to have to do when we find that we cannot deal with serious diseases the way we can now with antibiotics. I want to thank our witnesses today for joining us. And I hope that from our witnesses, we can begin to get this country on a track where we practice sound, evidence-based public policy that can make us better stewards of antibiotic use and of our future, and how we can assist all of the stakeholders in this public health issue. More specifically, we need to learn, amongst other things, how do we prevent the spread of infections that require antibiotic treatments? How do we best educate patients and doctors about judicious and prudent use of antibiotics? And finally, how do we improve upon the current incentives and regulatory structures that bring new antibiotics and diagnostic tests into the marketplace? The growing number of bacteria resistant to antibiotics is frightening and will become more so. Even more frightening is the thought that our health providers and general public have not realized the magnitude of the problem that we face with resistant bacteria. Less effective treatments for bacterial infections mean longer-lasting illnesses, more doctor visits, extended hospital stays, the need for more expensive and toxic medications, and in a growing number of cases, death of the patient. Our children are at a greater risk because they have the highest rates of antibiotic use. We have to be smart about our approach in addressing this issue, and today's hearing should provide great insight and direction. And it is time that we recognize the urgency of this situation. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Dingell. Next is our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always good to have a hearing looking to the future. We look forward to the testimony today of the individuals who are going to testify about our antibiotics and what we're doing to make sure that the next generation of antibiotics continues to be as effective as the current generation is. We also look forward, Mr. Chairman, to having you and the full committee chairman at some point in time schedule some hearings on the new health care law. We find daily evidence that it's not what it appears to be. HHS has already missed numerous deadlines. We've had the CBO and other budget agents come out that instead of saving money, it's going to cost hundreds of billions, perhaps $1 trillion more than estimated. The president must think it's in some trouble. He had a campaign-style rally this week trying to drum up support. You know, we need to do due diligence, and if there are things in the law that need to be changed, the sooner we get about changing them, the better it'll be for the American people. So I hope that that happens sooner rather than later. But in terms of today's hearing, we do look forward to our testimony from our witnesses, because this is an issue that does deserve some attention, and we appreciate you giving it to us. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, for holding this hearing on antibiotic resistance, which is a growing concern for scientists, for the medical community, for patients, and certainly for policymakers. I want to extend a warm welcome to both Drs. Woodcock and Robinson, and thank you for the work, the important work that you do. The discovery of antibiotics transformed medical care in the 20th century. Many bacterial infections, which were once deadly, are now treatable illnesses. People no longer die from minor cuts, from ear infections or pneumonia. Antibiotics treat infections on the battlefield, after surgeries, and in doctors' offices across the country. But antibiotics are not the universal remedy to all illnesses. The widespread and inappropriate use of antibiotics leads to dangerous antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And due to the relatively low side effects of antibiotic use, physicians often prescribe them for maladies such as flu or the common cold. Antibiotics cannot treat these illnesses, and their misuse leads to the rise of antibiotic-resistant strains of illnesses. And as these strains appear, some patients may have nowhere to turn when they've exhausted their antibiotic options. Attempts to reduce antibiotic resistance must be comprehensive. We should curb the overuse of them and at the same time encourage the development of new antibiotics to keep pace with new strains of resistant infection. Antibiotic resistance has the potential to become a significant public health crisis. I'm especially interested to learn about what role BARDA and Project BioShield may play in the promoting the development of new antibiotics. So my thanks to the FDA for not only testifying today, but for your ongoing, I think, extraordinary work. And I look forward to working with members of all of the committee to address the issue of antibiotic resistance. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an important hearing, important witnesses. I'm going to submit my statement for the record and reserve time for questions.
Thank you. Our Vice Chair, gentlewoman from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and welcome to our witnesses in both panels. A few weeks ago, as others have recalled, we held an informative hearing on the subject of antibiotic resistance. I think this hearing is a logical follow-up to the many questions that arose at that time. Most importantly, how do we balance the simultaneous need to halt the development of antibiotic resistance while incentivizing the development of effective antibiotics and ensuring patient compliance? I think we'll learn from our witnesses today that the solution lies in a multifaceted approach that relies on, 1, improving our basic research capabilities, 2, incentivizing the private sector to invest in the necessary research and development, 3, better educating health professionals on the most effective prescription of antibiotics and the ways to do this, and last, and I'm sure there are more, making our public more aware of the ways they minimize risk of infection. Prevention, in other words. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on their suggestions for achieving these objectives and how we can develop the most appropriate policies to implement them. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Antibiotics are a critical treatment for many bacterial infections, and oftentimes their usage saves lives. Unfortunately, overutilization of antibiotics makes it more likely that bacterial resistance to antibiotic therapy will develop. Staying ahead of bacterial resistance to antibiotics is vital to our healthcare system. We can do that, in part, by educating medical providers on the proper use of these drugs. Many illnesses can be treated by proper diagnosis and over-the-counter remedies rather than relying on prescribing antibiotics. In many instances, it's appropriate and does not require much time or cost to take a culture in order to properly identify a patient's condition. If we are to combat bacterial infections, taking the necessary steps to identify appropriate cases for antibiotics is an important first step. Mr. Chairman, we must also be aware that patient demand plays a big part in the overutilization of antibiotics. In many instances, patients will request an antibiotic from their provider because they're convinced it will cure common infections faster than over-the-counter treatment, and that's certainly not always the case. Having spent time in general practice during my 30-year medical career, I understand how patient demands can influence provider decisions. Therefore, any education efforts should include those aimed at informing patients of the dangers of overusage of antibiotics. Unfortunately, no amount of education is going to stop antibiotic resistance. New forms of antibiotics must be available if we are to effectively deal with this emerging problem. Today, the high cost of drug development and short treatment courses have caused a decreasing number of companies to pursue antibiotic development. In other words, their success has led to the fact that there's a shortage now of antibiotics. Any solution geared toward addressing future bacterial infections must ensure that proper incentives are identified and supported that will encourage greater antibiotic development. This committee should not shy away from reviewing the pathway of drug development, from drug discovery all the way through to licensing. My hope is that a balanced and thorough review of the antibiotic market will help ensure that we properly identify any disincentives that may exist with regards to the production of new antibiotics and are better prepared to promote incentives that may reverse this current trend. I believe this problem is one that can best be solved by encouraging industry and government to work together to find the solutions that our future health needs require. Mr. Chairman, with these thoughts in mind, I'd like to thank you for holding today's hearing on this important and growing issue. I look forward to hearing the expert testimony from our distinguished panel of witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thanks to the witnesses as well. As you're aware, I've reintroduced legislation in this Congress, H.R. 2400, the Strategies to Address Antimicrobial Resistance Act, or the STAR Act, as the acronym is, which I believe is a comprehensive piece of legislation to strengthen our nation's response to pathogens that are increasingly becoming resistant to antibiotics. Senators Sherrod Brown and Orrin Hatch introduced the companion bill in the 110th Congress. Over 25 health care stakeholders support this legislation, a number of which will testify today in this hearing. H.R. 2400 provides strategies and authorizes critically needed funding to strengthen federal antimicrobial resistance surveillance, prevention and control, and research efforts. It also strengthens coordination within the Department of Health and Human Services agencies as well as across other federal departments that are important to addressing antimicrobial resistance and considers opportunities to address this issue globally. The STAR Act provides a rare opportunity to bring many partners together to protect public health. This legislation, developed with input from infectious disease experts and leaders in public health, provides authority for the federal government to combat antimicrobial resistance in 4 ways. Number 1, it reauthorizes the Antimicrobial Resistance Task Force, establishing an advisory board of outside experts and an antimicrobial resistance office reporting to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, whose director will coordinate government efforts to combat antimicrobial resistance. Number 2, it creates an antimicrobial resistance strategic research plan, as well as establish the Antimicrobial Resistance Surveillance and Research Network. Number 3, the bill calls for collecting available and relevant data to allow government to better address the antimicrobial resistance problem. And 4th, it establishes demonstration projects to encourage more appropriate use of existing antibiotics. Mr. Chairman, as you're aware, our committee has had a critical role in establishing the foundation of work for this issue. Our Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Dingell, requested a report on the impact of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the 103rd Congress. In the 106th Congress, Chairman Stupak introduced legislation to direct the Secretary of HHS to establish the Antimicrobial Resistance Task Force. In the 107th Congress, several members of this committee joined Senator Sherrod Brown, who at the point was a member of this committee, to introduce legislation to provide funding for the top priority action items of the Public Health Action Plan. I provide this brief snapshot of this history for my colleagues to show that while some work has been accomplished, the war against resistance infections looms large for our nation's public health. And to be clear for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, this is a public health emergency that in the year 2007 alone infected more than 94,000 people, and it's estimated to have cost our healthcare system millions of dollars. I look forward to the hearing today and hearing from our witnesses, and look forward to doing whatever we can to work with this committee to help move this legislation forward. I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 million people will acquire infections in hospitals this year. Between 90 and 100,000 will die. The cost will be about $50 billion to treat them. And by those numbers, so far today, this year, 44,133 people have died from a hospital-acquired infection. Although today we're talking about the overprescribing of antibiotics, let's understand the most effective antibiotic is the one you do not have to prescribe. Prevention does work. Hospitals that vigorously gather data on infection rates and enforce infection controls see declines in infection rates. But many doctors, families, hospital staff do not do this, and that is the root of one of our problems that we've got to address. Over time, I've introduced over repeated Congresses legislation to require hospitals and clinics to report their infection data. Unfortunately, we have not moved it forward at all in committee and has not moved anywhere in the House. This means
that hospitals are not required to gather information nor report their infection rates, and as such, a lot of people are dying because we're not paying attention to it. The solutions don't require great science or approval from the FDA. It means that people that go near a patient have to wash their hands, use sterile equipment, wear clean clothes such as gowns or gloves or masks, clean up before and after procedures, use antibiotics before and after surgery, and have close monitoring infection rates and quick reaction time when infections occur. So I've reintroduced this bill, once again, H.R. 3104. I hope that in addition to dealing with resistant bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, we also begin to deal with resistance by caregivers to passing legislation that requires them to report infection rates. To me, it is incomprehensible that the very providers who are out there saying we need to reduce infection rates are the ones opposed to finding out what those infection rates are. It's reprehensible that on one side of our mouth we're saying we want people to live, on the other side of the mouth we're saying please don't tell anybody that we're not doing a very good job about it. I hope that sometime this committee will consider this legislation, require hospitals and clinics to begin to look at these rates and report them. And in so doing, I might add, when hospitals do this, they save lives. It is repeatedly demonstrated. And once again, the most effective antibiotic is the one you don't have to use. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. Good morning. As I read the testimonies last night and reflected on the first hearing with Drs. Frieden and Fauci, I kept thinking that we're supposed to leave a better world for our children than we have. And there are many events that bring this into question, and the issue of the resistance, antibiotic resistance, which threatens to set the treatment of infectious diseases back into the dark ages, is one of them. Dr. Frieden's and Dr. Fauci's testimony were very informative, and the witnesses we will hear from today will add to our understanding of the issue and to their recommendations. As a family physician, like my colleague over here who practiced for over 20 years, I know the pressures that doctors are under to prescribe antibiotics and how difficult it is to have a patient continue on their regimen once they start to feel better. And those are but two of our challenges. The fact that only 5 out of several hundred drugs in the pipeline were antibiotics speaks volumes to the level of the crisis and the need to incentivize the pharmaceutical industry, something I recall not doing very well initially with BioShield, but greatly improving on in 2006 with BARDA. This is a multifaceted problem in which everyone, from the patient to the provider and all the healthcare workers, to the industry, the department, and Congress, have an important role to play. We have several agencies and pieces of legislation with which we can begin to address the crisis, and I look forward to what our witnesses have to say about them. I want to thank you, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Shimkus, for this hearing, and the witnesses for their presence and for their very informative testimonies. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen. I just wanted to yield briefly to our Ranking Member, Mr. Barton, for a personal point.
Yeah, I want to make a point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman. Congresswoman Blackburn, whose birthday was yesterday, is smiling amongst us, and she has had the great foresight to hire my stepdaughter, or to employ my stepdaughter as one of her interns. Lindsay Thomas is a junior at the University of Texas, majoring, I believe, in business with a minor in marketing, and she did some of the work to prepare for the hearing today. So I want to introduce Marcia's intern and my stepdaughter, Lindsay Taylor, to the committee. Wave.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Welcome. And happy birthday to you also, Marcia. No, we don't want to hear anybody's age here. Thanks. Next is the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to those that are here today, and thank you for the work that you have done in preparation for coming to us. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the hearing today. Interesting little tidbit as we prepared for this. According to the Tennessee Department of Health, the antibiotic-resistant rates in Tennessee are among the highest in the nation. And we know that this has come from overuse and misuse of antibiotics, and it has contributed to this. This is something we've been fighting in our state for a long time, as prescription usage was higher than it should be. We know that it is a looming public health crisis, and it is of concern to us when we look at the rising incidence of drug-resistant bacteria. And we're concerned about the stagnant R&D of new therapies to treat some of these new infections. It is alarming that medical professionals have very few resources to treat some of these patients, as demand far outpaces supply of the antimicrobials. While prevention is key, not every infection is preventable. And we understand that, but there is a growing concern about R&D. And it concerns me that there are only a few small private companies that are investing in R&D and putting their money into that and developing the new therapies that are needed. And we know it's difficult to hit a moving target. And as the antimicrobial pathogens constantly mutate, resulting in long-term R&D investment needs, and also realizing that for many of these there's a short-term usage. So and the other thing we're concerned about, and that we hear from our medical community about, is uncertainty from the FDA. So as we go through the hearing today, those are points that we're going to want to cover with you: the concern about R&D, the concern about uncertainty with the FDA, and then also just the antibiotic resistance rates that we see in our state. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Blackburn. And I guess last, although I'm not sure, is the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. At least you didn't say I was last and least. So I'll submit my opening statement for the record. I just want to point out a couple of facts that are even more disturbing than some of the facts we've heard from the members. 1/3 of the world's population is infected with TB, and in 2008, multi-drug resistant TB accounted for 5% of all tuberculosis cases, which is the highest percentage recorded to date. And even more frightening is the emergence of extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis that is resistant to all major TB drugs available. In the United States, 70% of the 2 million people who die from hospital-acquired infections were infected with strains resistant to at least one antibiotic. And according to the CDC, $1.1 billion is spent annually on unnecessary antibiotic prescriptions for adult upper respiratory infections. Those billions of dollars could be spent on developing new antimicrobials, not needlessly encouraging antibiotic resistance. Unfortunately, antibiotic resistance will never go away because bacteria has an incredible capacity to evolve and multiply. Bacteria have existed on Earth 1,000 times longer than we have and can undergo 500,000 generations in the time it takes humans to undergo one generation. And so really, all the members today agree that we need to proactively confront antibiotic resistance. We can't eliminate it, but what we can do is significantly reduce the rate and spread of antibiotic-resistant pathogens. So everybody has noted it's important that we use antibiotics prudently, but prudent use alone is not enough. We need a multi-pronged approach that has regulation, surveillance, research, and obviously new discoveries must rigorously be pursued in parallel. In addition, while it's not the topic of the hearing today, we need to look very closely at overuse of antibiotics in agriculture, because that's another big problem that we face. So it's a multi-pronged problem. I'm glad, Mr. Chairman, you're looking at it in a multiple series of hearings. And since I'm the last witness, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time so we can hear from our distinguished witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daggett. So that does conclude the opening statements by our members, and we'll turn to our first panel, who are already seated. I want to welcome you. On our first panel to our left, or to my left, I should say, is Dr. Janet Woodcock, who's Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. And next to her is Dr. Robin Robinson, who's Director of Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority with the Department of Health and Human Services. You know the drill, 5-minute opening statements. They become part of the record, and you can submit additional written statements in writing for inclusion in the record after, if you like. So I'll begin with Dr. Woodcock. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Janet Woodcock. I'm the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. And I thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. Maintaining access to life-saving antibiotics and combating antimicrobial resistance are critically important to the FDA. As a rheumatologist, I can attest both to the power of these drugs as they saved the lives of many of my immunocompromised patients, and to the tragedy when they were really not enough to combat the infection and I lost young patients, some of the most difficult episodes of my professional career. Antimicrobial therapy is really one of the triumphs of modern medicine. Lewis Thomas, who's one of our distinguished American physician, clinician, and scientists, witnessed the dawn of the antibiotic era when he was a medical trainee. And he describes the transformation from helplessness in the face of almost certain death of a patient to intervention that could rapidly restore a patient to health. We can't go back to this helplessness, and I think that's what drives the concern about antibiotic resistance. These were truly wonder drugs at that time. But what was not known at the time is that these medicines came with an expiration date. The use of antimicrobials, especially indiscriminate use, will affect the timing of that expiration date. But every antibiotic will get to the end of its usefulness, as the members have already said, because the microbes have many strategies to elude our chemical attacks. And so we must use our intelligence, our science, and our technology to stay ahead of the microbes. We must use antimicrobials carefully to prolong their effectiveness, but we must also have new interventions in the pipeline. Over the last half-century, biomedicine has relied upon the private sector to fill this pipeline, fueled by government-supported basic science. This arrangement has produced a vast array of active antimicrobials. However, over the last 2 decades, a combination of economic and scientific factors has decreased this productivity. The pipeline is diminished at a time when the need could not be greater. I'd like to provide some insight into the scientific problems that we face. Our success in developing antimicrobials means that most common infections are adequately treated with existing therapy. This change in the history of the infections makes it more difficult to study new treatments. For critically ill individuals, though, time is of the essence in getting a treatment, and delays to obtain consent and to complete study enrollment are often not acceptable and limit enrollment of very ill patients into studies of new treatments. And the historical widespread antibiotic use has resulted in a patchwork of resistance problems that have already been alluded to. In the absence of rapid diagnostic tests for the identity and the resistance patterns of the infecting organisms, doctors don't know what they are facing when they're treating an individual patient. These factors create the need for new scientific methods to study antimicrobial drugs. FDA has been working with the scientific community to develop these methods. This is an example of regulatory science, the kind that's been advanced by Dr. Peggy Hamburg, our FDA commissioner. FDA plans to publish additional guidance on these methods within the next 6 months to help establish new scientific standards for evaluation of antimicrobial drugs. In closing, I'd like to add a note of optimism to this picture. The filings for new studies of experimental antibiotics in people, which are called INDs, the first test of a new therapy in humans, has been in a steep decline since 1987. And every year, we've seen fewer and fewer new compounds come into the clinic for testing. But in the last 3 years, we've seen a reversal of this trend with a sharp upward move. We have seen more small companies and startups involved in the field, and interest in medically important infectious conditions that lack good treatment. This may be good news for our patients. But to bring this into the hands of doctors, to bring these new innovations into the hand of doctors, will require concerted effort on the part of academia, government, and the private sector. And we hope to contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. Dr. Robinson?
Good morning, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Shimkus, Chairman Waxman Dingell, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm Robin Robinson, Director of Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, known most of you as BARDA at HHS. Antimicrobial resistance is a major concern to you, to the nation, and also to BARDA. And we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about how we're going to move forward in combating this problem. As has been stated, antimicrobials are primary weapons in the fight against old and new infectious diseases. The discovery and development of antibiotics in the mid-20th century is among the greatest advances in the history of medicine and public health, and they remain a mainstay in our treatment and use of medicine. In addition to the antibiotics resistance being a problem in community-acquired diseases, antibiotic resistance provides an additional concern to BARDA, as resistance to current antimicrobials could be intentionally introduced by genetic manipulation into otherwise susceptible bacteria, including bioterrorism bacterial agents, producing a biological superweapon that would render our stockpiles of antibiotics obsolete during an attack. Further, naturally occurring drug-resistant isolates of several biodefense pathogens, including plague, have been detected by environmental and clinical surveillance, making the availability of antibiotic-resistant bioterrorism pathogens even more feasible. Thus, the increasing prevalence of antimicrobial-resistant bacteria is not only a matter of concern for public health, but of national security. Antibiotic resistance is further exacerbated by the dearth of antibiotic candidates that are coming through the development pipeline, with a little bit of a glimmer coming from what Dr. Woodcock has just said. The consequences of the limited antibiotic development pipeline are obvious and seen every day among medical practitioners and public health officers, with tragic outcomes for growing numbers of patients and using drugs that are becoming obsolete. The public health and biodefense repercussions of antibiotic resistance call for greater public-private partnerships between the federal government and industry to provide the necessary support, core clinical development and manufacturing services, and incentives to make a robust development pipeline of new classes of antibiotics and other products. Into this setting of escalating antibiotic resistance, what can BARDA do? BARDA was established by the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness Act of 2006 to ensure the United States has sufficient supply of vaccine and drugs to respond to public health emergencies caused by pandemic influenza, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats, and emerging infectious diseases. BARDA uniquely bridges a critical gap referred to as the Valley of Death in the public health, medical, and biodefense infrastructure that is facilitating the advanced development, manufacturing, and acquisitions of medical countermeasures that have little or no commercial markets by forging public and private partnerships. In its short history, BARDA has taken a multi-pronged approach to pandemic influenza and biodefense medical countermeasure programs to stimulate drug and vaccine development and manufacturing capabilities. Similarly, we propose that we move forward with this multi-pronged approach for antibiotic resistance. This approach and the authorities provided by the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness Act would allow BARDA to develop new classes of antibiotics as well as other medicines, including vaccines and diagnostics that are authorized under PAPA for BARDA to address in this fight against antibiotic resistance. So what would our strategy be for combating antibiotic resistance? First, to continue our development of new classes of broad-spectrum antimicrobials, not only for biodefense, but for public health. Secondly, vaccines for high-priority bacterial pathogens, and these vaccines would be safe for Staph aureus that would combat MRSA. And lastly, point-of-care diagnostics for high-priority bacterial pathogens, which would actually change the way that medicine could be practiced by actually having point-of-care diagnostics that a physician could be informed to provide the appropriate care for the patients. Together, these would actually have a ripple effect not only on antimicrobial resistance, but also in the pipeline for other drugs by using multi-utilization platform technologies. And moving forward with these together, we think that we can make a big difference going forward. So I look forward to being able to answer questions for you in BARDA's section of the pie as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson, and we'll move right to questions, and I'll recognize myself initially. I wanted to ask Dr. Woodcock a question. A couple of the witnesses on the second panel, which we haven't heard from, but we have their testimony, they cite regulatory uncertainty as one of the factors contributing to why there's so few effective antibiotics on the market today, and that this uncertainty compounds the other economic disincentives that confront companies considering investing in the development of new antibiotics. An example of this regulatory uncertainty, according to one of the witnesses, they cite the FDA's failure to finalize certain documents that would provide guidance to industry on how to satisfy FDA's requirements for pre-market clinical trials of specified antibiotics. Now, your testimony, Dr. Woodcock, describes some of the difficult questions and issues surrounding these clinical trials on new antibiotics, and I recognize that the stakes here are high. But on the one hand, you're faced with what we all recognize as a dangerous lack of new, safe, and effective antibiotics. On the other hand, FDA doesn't want to approve new antibiotics that not only may not work, but could also contribute to the resistance problem. So formulating these guidelines is obviously not easy, but I wanted you to tell us some more about the difficulties you've faced in developing and completing these guidelines, if you will.
Well, first of all, let me say that the regulatory path is pretty clear for a obviously superior treatment. So if a treatment were developed that could beat other antibiotics or treat resistant therapy where no other antibiotic is effective, that regulatory path is very clear. The problem is for treatment areas where there's a lot of satisfactory therapy. And those are typically the targets for commercial development because, as some of the members already alluded to, those are very widespread in the community. Right. Sinusitis and so forth. Mm-hmm. Though, where there's very effective therapy out there, it is difficult to tell whether a new treatment is actually equivalent to the existing treatments. And we don't want to run the risk of successively approving more inferior treatments to the point where at some point we've approved therapies that aren't actually effective.
Okay.
So we are developing new scientific methods to evaluate these conditions in a time where there's adequate antibiotic therapy out there, and that it is more difficult to do that. However, companies that wish to pursue other types of infections that are currently not very well treated, that's a clearer path, but that is not as commercially desirable a path to get onto the market.
And now, what about the timelines? Can you tell us the anticipated timelines for completing the draft guidelines you listed in your testimony? And then what would companies, or what should companies do now before they're completed? Can they rely on the draft guidances or wait until they're finalized?
Companies may come to the FDA and obtain advice on individual basis, development plan basis, and that's what companies can do right now, is talk to the FDA. But in an era, in a time of some scientific uncertainty, there's more risk to development. But I would reiterate that this is for these common infections, many of them that have currently satisfactory treatment. We do expect to move to finalize many of our guidances that we have published in draft. We are going to publish in the next 6 months several additional drafts of versions, because there has been a great deal of scientific controversy about these evaluation methods and what methods would reliably result in effective antibiotics being approved by the FDA, which is what we all, I think, want.
But you're still talking about drafts, though. What about the final documents?
Yes, we will move to finalize these documents as rapidly as possible. We are moving to finalize some of the documents.
Okay. I mean, it seems like, these are very difficult scientific issues, but at the same time, it's important to get them right. But I mean, I just wanted to stress how important it is to resolve these issues and get these guidelines finalized as soon as possible. I know you're not giving me specific timelines, but it's really important to get it moving.
We agree with that, and we have recently entered into a collaboration to do some what we call qualification work, which people might call validation work. We're looking at these new endpoints in clinical trials and see how they perform. And that's the kind of regulatory science work that really can move this ahead and provide everyone with the confidence that these new scientific methods are the right methods to test these new products and move them efficiently through the pipeline. So we agree, but unfortunately there was some scientific work that had to be done to get these into final.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Shimkus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm going to follow your line, but first, Dr. Woodcock, the chairman had the benefit of receiving testimony from the second panel to read what they said, to ask you questions. The FDA submitted your testimony at 9:20 p.m. last night. Or at least the minority staff got it at 9:20 p.m., which is way from the 48 hours. So we just want to raise that issue to ensure that we get timely submission so we can do our due diligence on our side, just as the chairman did. And that does help, just to have a heads up of what the second panel is going to do. Following into my questioning, I'm going to follow this line of thought on the antibiotic development and regulatory uncertainty, which you were already alluding to. What we've heard is that there's not certainty, or it's unclear the type of clinical trials that are needed. And when companies have invested a lot of capital in the trials, only then to be told that their clinical trials were insufficient. What can you do from a regulatory perspective to help clear up this regulatory uncertainty?
There is no doubt that predictability is one of the most important things for incentivizing commercial development in a specific indication area. So those who have to invest money need to know that if they dot all the I's and cross all the T's, that they can get and the drug works and is safe, they can get it across the finish line. We recognize that, and we do everything possible to provide that predictability of development path. However, as science changes, we have to, and the history of the diseases have changed based on the availability of all these other effective antibiotics, we have had to change the evaluation methods. That created a transition period that was very uncomfortable. We hope we are reaching the end of that transition period so that we have new designs that are very clear and we have predictable development paths. But I will say, I think that the time when companies seek to get sort of blockbuster antibiotics to treat otitis media or respiratory conditions and so forth, and get those on the market and get a very wide, that is not exactly what you were talking about here, I think, in getting a new pipeline moving through. You're talking about getting new effective antibiotics.
Right. My follow-up will be on the pipeline. So, I mean, your analysis is correct, but it seems to me that what you're saying is you don't need any additional authority to bring this certainty. You just need to make a decision per new antibiotic regime of what's then going to be considered as a safe clinical trial, right? You have the authority to do this.
Yes, we have the authority. We need an evaluation method that we can rely upon. So if you test the antibiotic with that method, you can reliably say that antibiotic works, because that's what we're assuring the
right.
physicians and the patients is, if you take this antibiotic is an effective antibiotic.
Then following up on what you mentioned before, is the pipeline there?
We are seeing, yes, the pipeline is diminished and has been for many years. What we're seeing in the very early stages of clinical development is a remarkable upturn. We can't guarantee.
And that's in your testimony. You talked about the decline, but then some new submissions by smaller companies right in your testimony. Do you need to encourage more people to now get involved so that the pipeline is not bare? Do you need any more additional authority?
I don't think it's FDA authorities. Our role is to make sure these treatments are safe and effective, and that there's a clear development path for these. It is clear, I think, to everyone that more incentives of some type or some type of encouragement of investors and companies and scientists and so forth to enter into this area is needed.
Yeah, thank you. Let me move quickly, Dr. Robinson. What is your role in fostering new antibiotic development?
As I said in my testimony, we are responsible for antimicrobials for biothreats as part of our Project BioShield mandate, but we're also responsible for emerging infectious disease as mandated by PAPA. And we are reaching out further with dual-purpose antibiotics, not only for plague, tularemia, and so forth, but also we'll be going forward with community diseases, including those that are gram-negative microorganisms. We see that the antibiotic resistance to TB really needs a very specific set of drugs, and other approaches, including that are non-antibiotics, and where a vaccine or vaccines may be applicable, such as I mentioned to the Staph aureus with MRSA, but also with diagnostics, as Dr. Frieden talked about and Dr. Fauci did, that one of the ways that we can help physicians immediately is by having point-of-care diagnostics that allow them to make the proper diagnosis and then prescribe the correct drugs.
My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just want to join with what Mr. Shimkus' comments about the timeliness of the testimony. I understand it came in, maybe a little earlier than what he said, but the bottom line is we didn't get it till yesterday evening, and it's supposed to be 48 hours. And, members, not that I'm trying to bemoan us, but, we come in for votes at 6:30, and if we, it's almost impossible to read the testimony the night before when you're just arriving here for votes. So if I would just ask you and the FDA, because I know he's pointed this out several times with the FDA and Health and Human Services, we really need to get the testimony in a timely fashion. Otherwise, we really can't formulate, questions or really have an effective hearing. So I just wanted to mention that again. The next, Mr. Waxman. Oh, is the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen?
Thank you. I didn't expect to be coming up this quickly. And thank you both for being here and for your testimony again. Dr. Woodcock, at the end of your testimony, you gave us a little bit of good news. So to what do you attribute the increase, or have you been able to attribute it to anything, the increase in the new investigations of antimicrobial drugs?
We are seeing this to some extent across the board in drug development, and I attribute it both to the new science that has identified a lot of new targets genetics and so forth. So that's number one. Number two, there's a changing structure of the industry, and there are a lot more players and different players who are getting into development, and that's probably good news for diversity. And otherwise, I don't think we know, but I think those are two of the major factors.
Thank you. Dr. Robinson, BARDA seems to have a fair amount of authority with regard to addressing this issue. Is there any authority, further authority, that BARDA would need to help us address this crisis?
Thank you, ma'am. We have actually looked at this very carefully, and we believe right now that with PAPA that we do have the authority to move forward with this multi-pronged approach that we're suggesting that will allow advanced development of all of these medical countermeasures to move forward. So I think right now we're okay.
And I guess to both of you, one of the individuals on the second panel suggests that the federal government has not really been as good or as strong a partner as they need to be. So you said you don't need any other authority. Is funding the limitation?
I'll speak first on that. Because we have a number of different mandates, and the funding for advanced development only came about in really the FY07 budget, we certainly would need more resources to be able to address all the different priorities that we have, including antibiotic resistance. Yes.
Dr. Woodcock?
We accomplish what we can with the resources that we have. There are needs for regulatory science that are quite broad, and this is one area. The research into the endpoints and trial design could help accelerate, obviously, getting guidances out in a timely manner and so forth. The President's budget for 2011 has a request for increase in regulatory science by the FDA Commissioner. So I think we're limited to some extent because of, like Dr. Robinson, by the large number of priorities that we deal with.
And Dr. Woodcock, you also talked about some of the limitations in terms of the research limitations, but the plan that the Interagency Task Force put together has been in effect for 10 years. What % or how much of that plan has been implemented, and what other barriers might you have run into in implementing much of what you have set out?
Well, I believe that plan will be updated and republished. There have been elements of that that have been accomplished, but there's a plan to update the plan and publish it with timelines for accomplishment of various activities, which I think will help move that program along.
Well, I didn't have a chance to look at the plan, but has 10%, 30% of it been implemented over the 10 years?
I'm sorry, I can't give you, we can get back to you on that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. Dr. Woodcock, I would like to revisit this issue of lack of clarity and simply ask the question, in your view, is the criticism valid that the FDA does have a lack of clarity and it's unclear as to what type of clinical trials will be required for demonstrating safety and effectiveness? We hear a lot of criticism of the FDA in that regard. So do you, in your view, is that criticism valid or not valid?
I would say it is valid to say that the scientific community has a lack of clarity on how to best evaluate new antibiotics, and that's reflected in the fact that the FDA is struggling to get new guidances out there that reflect new evaluation methods that will be effective in today's environment.
Okay.
So had there been clarity in the scientific community, I think FDA could have effected this change very rapidly.
Okay.
But due to the lack of clarity, we had to go through a great deal of effort to gain some type of consensus on how to do this.
It's seldom that the scientific community has very much clarity anyway, isn't it? Or
Yeah. Well, we are no strangers to controversy in the area of how to evaluate medical products. However, this was a change that occurred, say, between the 1980s and 2000, 1990 to 2000, or a change that happened rapidly, and it's been very difficult to get a new state of clarity about how to do this antibiotic development.
would you explain the Orphan Drug Act for me, please? And also, it's my understanding that there are grants available under the Orphan Drug Act and the amount of money involved in those grants. And it's also my understanding that you all were required in the 207 Act to have a public hearing, which I think occurred in April maybe of this past year, and what the results of that were and what you all are doing to follow up on those recommendations.
The Orphan Drug Act allows for incentives, grants, as well as exclusivity for products to get on the market for products that are intended to treat populations smaller than 200,000 individuals in the United States.
Smaller than 200,000.
Mm-hmm. And so this has been a wildly successful program in incentivizing the development of drugs for small populations. And I think there's agreement across the board about that, which is very rare to get such agreement. So it's been a very successful program. Its applicability to antibiotics is limited to the extent that where the population is often larger than that of treated patients for the given indication. But for small indications where there's fewer than 200,000 people that would have that present with that condition in the United States, then the orphan provisions are germane.
And what is the dollar value of the grants that would be available under that program?
I don't know. We'd have to get back to you on that. I think they vary.
Okay.
But one of the more valuable issues is the orphan exclusivity that is given to the product once, if it successfully gets on the market.
And how did that April hearing go or forum go?
Again, I would have to get back to you on that. I don't have the details of it.
You were not there?
No.
Okay. I yield back, balance my time.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes. He has no questions. Go back to Mr. Burgess, who actually has 8 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you both for being here. Very, very informative discussion. Dr. Woodcock, you made the statement during your testimony that the microbes have strategies. I guess that begs the question: do we? Because it does seem like we've got a problem both with the product in the pipeline and perhaps the pipeline itself may be old and rusty and full of obstacles. So are we, how do you feel about how we're updating that infrastructure to get this job done?
Well, obviously we all agree that prudent use is, and preventing infection is one of the mainstays of this, but we also must have a pipeline. And I feel that many of the issues covered by the members already, such as the short-term use of antibiotics, the regulatory or scientific difficulties nowadays in developing the development path, until recently probably the lack of new targets, because the antibiotics were often all focused on the same microbial targets, and now there's a broader range of targets. So I think there is room for optimism. However, I do believe that that more commercial interest in this field needs to occur to really get the pipeline robust.
Well, now, Dr. Robinson mentioned two issues. One, but let's stay with you, Dr. Woodcock, because the FDA plays a role here in their becoming available. One was the point-of-care diagnostics, and the other were the vaccines, where you go from a broader spectrum now down to a narrower spectrum. But if you have fewer bugs that are actually able to become resistant, then you'll reduce the likelihood of resistance. So how is the FDA doing as far as getting those two tools that BARDA is developing? How's the FDA doing at getting those into the hands of clinicians?
The FDA has approved several point-of-care diagnostics recently. Several diagnostics for MRSA. However, they have to go through an additional step of the CLIA process to be approved for use in the practitioner's office. But I think this is very promising as far as that rapid microbial testing can be developed.
This is a problem, though, because, I mean, when CLIA, I wasn't here, but CLIA meant that we couldn't even make a microscopic slide and look at it under the microscope for clinically easily recognizable pathogens because I was not licensed to do that. So what happened, of course, I would do it and not charge for it, not tell anyone I was doing it. So my clinical acumen tells me this is X, even though I've identified it under the microscope. What a waste of time. Are we trying to improve that part as well, or is that beyond the scope of the FDA?
CLIA, as you know, is administered by CMS. However, this particular issue is simply to show that the diagnostic is effective and used in the hands of the practitioner, and then it can be used in the hands of the practitioner. All right. So it's simply a demonstration that practitioners can use such a diagnostic, like the rapid strep test or whatever, in the setting of an office.
Yeah, I didn't mean to get off on that. I still have a great deal of emotional difficulty with the affronts to my clinical judgment from CLIA. But let me ask you this. The new molecular entities approved by the FDA in the last decade. I think for the last hearing, my staff had prepared for me a list of 10 new molecular entities. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, yes.
Is that okay? One a year for the last decade, or now over the last decade?
Well, this reflects this slide in the pipeline since 1987, where the new INDs have progressively decreased every year since 1987 until recently. So it takes about 5 or 6 years in the clinic from first in human studies to see therapies coming out and being available to doctors.
Now, do you know, are there any applications that have been filed with the FDA to get approval for new diagnostics for bacterial infections? Do you know if you've approved any? Has the FDA approved any of those new diagnostics?
As I said, we've approved several over the last several years, yes, for rapid diagnostics.
What, Mr. Waxman, who unfortunately is not here, asked unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from Advanced Life Sciences, and I asked to look at it just because I wanted to see what he was putting into the record. But it's very interesting. I mean, here's a company that has developed a single dose or once a day oral therapy for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and we talk about patient compliance. You tell a patient they've got to take something every 4 hours, guess what? They ain't going to do it.
Right.
They'll do what I did, which I don't recommend, which is you take the antibiotic to toxicity and then back off, and if you feel better, you don't take it anymore. That's what patients do. That's real-world stuff. So if you give them one pill a day, they're much more likely to comply with the regimen. So this actually sounds like something that might be very useful. We've got a pathogen that is a serious pathogen for community-acquired pneumonia. It's a multiply resistant Staph aureus, a once-a-day therapy. And here the company has done all the stuff they needed to do to get it going, and then the rules changed on them in the middle of the application, and they had to go back to square one. This is a small company. This is not one of the big houses that now we say won't participate in. This is exactly the type of company we want involved in this, and they're apparently coming to Chairman Waxman with the information that they can't, they had to start all over again, significant cost to them because they are a small startup company. What do you say to that? Why are we putting these kind of obstacles out there?
Well, it's a very difficult situation when the scientific needs for scientific evaluation change during a development program, and it is very difficult for small companies. We try to avoid that as much as we can, but the science may change in advance during the time.
Recognize that, but can you not, in the advisory panels, can you not build in the flexibility as you're going through these? I mean, you change the endpoints after the new drug application has been submitted. They've already invested considerable time and money. They could walk away from the project. Fortunately, they have not, because I think this is a product that ultimately will benefit patients. But really, it seems like there's got to be more flexibility. These are relatively unique situations that develop, but more flexibility at the regulatory side to deal with just these types of problems. I mean, I suffice it to say, if Sir Alexander Fleming had come up against this, he might have never had a statue of himself erected by the bullfighters in Spain because he wouldn't have been able to get penicillin cleared through your agency.
Right. We understand I can't discuss any specific case, but we certainly do try to build in flexibility, and we recognize that changing, and that's actually built into our procedures. We try not to change our advice or requirements during a development program if at all possible.
I don't mean to interrupt, but my time's going to run out, and they are really tough on me with the gavel here. But are you really feel like you're getting a clear regulatory pathway so everyone can know the rules, and then if we do change the rules in the middle, we at least have some certainty for these companies that they're going to be, at some point, the regulations will cease and they will get to either a yes or no on their product, because that's, after all, what they need to hear.
We recognize how important that is to stimulate and sustain development in any indication area. We definitely recognize that predictability is key.
Thank you,
Since you suggested we should be tough, I guess we'll have to be.
I'll give you back Mr. Waxman's
Okay.
Submission for the record.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I've never thought you wielded a heavy gavel, but I'd ask permission to submit my opening statement for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. All members may submit their members without even making the request, actually.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Robinson, you explained some of the challenges that hinder antibiotic development, and I'd like to ask about a potential solution encouraging companies to work on developing antibiotics, advanced market commitment. I understand the way the strategy works. The government contracts for the company to buy a certain number of doses of a product at a specific price. This gives the company a certain level of assurance that there will be a market for their product on an agreed-upon price. This is similar to what you do for other certain countermeasures, which traditional market forces doesn't work, smallpox or anthrax vaccines. Do you think this approach, should we consider antibiotics for this approach?
Well, certainly because we have antibiotics as part of our mainstay against biothreats, I'd have to say, this is something we have to consider going forward. As public health reasons, it should be openly discussed with the medical communities and also considered as one of our possibilities to incentivize going forward, yes.
And one of my concerns about stockpiling is that we also have shelf life, obviously, to antibiotics and any other medication, and that's something you've dealt with, though, with the smallpox and anthrax vaccines, I assume.
Well, certainly with the therapeutics, we have the shelf life extension program that the FDA has so admirably held for a number of years now, and I think that we can utilize that going forward with new antibiotics that would come into the stockpile.
Okay. So you don't see any logistical challenges? I mean, you've already addressed some of the challenges with other medications. You could do the same with antibiotics.
That's correct. It would be a policy issue at this point.
Okay. Dr. Woodcock, one of the suggestions for creating incentives for antibiotic is expand the concept of tropical disease priority review vouchers established under the FDA Amendments Act. Such a voucher would entitle the holder to get a drug reviewed with a target completion time of 6 months. Under such an approach, FDA would give a company a priority review voucher as a reward for developing a qualified infectious disease product. The company could use the voucher for a drug of its choice or could sell it to another country. Dr. Woodcock, could you tell us how the existing tropical disease program has worked for the FDA, from the FDA's perspective? Does it seem like a workable approach for important new antibiotics? And what are the trade-off in terms of FDA review of other drugs if we have that 6-month provision in there?
Well, I don't think that there has been enough activity so far under the tropical disease provisions to provide an assessment, but we can get back to you on exactly what's happened. But I don't think there's been enough action there to provide an assessment. As far as the trade-offs, I think if you wanted to think of this more broadly and apply it more broadly, what this does would decrease the FDA review time from 10 months to 6 months for any given product, and it could be applied to any product. And most likely a company would apply it to a product that would normally be for a chronic disease, widespread treatment, right, and might be used to treat tens of millions of Americans, all right? And this would mean that FDA would have to review that much faster than ordinary because the voucher had been applied to that. So I think there's some limitations on that approach because when we get so many, a lot of priority reviews, especially for where we're reviewing a drug that tens of millions of Americans might be exposed to it, and it may be for a chronic but not really important condition. We have to be really sure of the safety of that drug. We have to do a very, very careful review. And if we had large numbers of short reviews for products like that, I think that would be problematic for our review structure.
Okay. I know one of the concerns I have is I have a district in Houston, Texas, and we're seeing many more tropical diseases, for example, that are coming into our country, whether it's global warming or what. But if there's a problem in the Rio Grande Valley, it's going to be in Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and shortly in Chicago and other places. So that's why I think some of that is really needed to respond to in our own country, much less what's happening in other parts of the world. Mr. Chairman, I actually gave you 6 seconds back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, I want to read an excerpt into the hearing record from the administration's own interagency task force on antimicrobial resistance. The task force wrote a public health action plan in 2008 that reads in part, existing market incentives and regulatory processes may be insufficient to stimulate the development of certain priority antimicrobial resistant products while fostering their appropriate use. The goal is to investigate and act upon potential approaches for stimulating and speeding the entire antimicrobial resistant product development process from drug discovery through licensing. Drs. Woodcock and Robinson, do you agree with that statement?
It's critically important if you want to increase the activity in a given sector to provide adequate incentives. And discovery is important because we need new targets. We need antimicrobials that are going against a broader range of activities of the microbes. And development is important because it requires a great deal of investment to get a product through, and there has to be seen some type of return on investment in order to get robust investment in that sector. So I think those things are extremely important, and we have to think them through very carefully.
So you do agree. Dr. Robinson, would you agree also as well?
Yes, I would agree. Yeah. Absolutely, because advanced development is the area that BARDA plays. That when Dr. Fauci was here, he was talking about discovery and early development, and then the market over here. Well, that's what BARDA does. It makes sure it can get from early development all the way to the market.
Doctors, can you tell the committee what organizations actually co-chair this task force, administration's interagency task force on antimicrobial resistance?
I believe CDC, NIH, and FDA.
I think you're right, Dr. Woodcock. Dr. Robinson, you won't have to second guess her. That's exactly right. If your 2008 report is true, and it is a report that is co-chaired by CDC, HHS, and FDA, as Dr. Woodcock knew and reported, if the report is true, and we do need to look outside current market and regulatory incentives to stimulate antibiotic development, what other incentives might we as a government provide? Would liability, as an example, would liability protection in certain circumstances help support greater innovation? Dr. Robinson?
Yeah, I mean, with the liability relief that has been provided previously by Congress with the PREP Act, we have actually applied that with declarations during events that it would include some of the antibiotics. And what we were told by industry was that that was very helpful, and that some form of liability relief is important going forward.
Sort of like in the vaccine production when we really needed something to combat H1N1. Yeah. Dr. Woodcock?
Well, I think I don't have a further opinion on the liability issue. Obviously, any type of incentive is important. I think any incentives have to be considered in light of whether or not you want to have restrictions at the other end, because one of the goals here would be to restrict the use or moderate the use or make sure the use is very prudent of the intervention to preserve its effect as long as possible. And that's, we have our current problems with the pipeline, but if we contemplated a pipeline that would end up with antimicrobials, it would only be used in niche situations where they were really needed, that would be either even a further disincentive. So, but you have to think about that as a goal to preserve the effect of that for a long time to protect the population, and what kind of incentives would stimulate that?
Well, certainly I have an opinion on that, and a very definitive opinion in regard to the development of the vaccines. I felt like liability protection was absolutely essential for us to move forward in that direction. Now, this last question real quickly, and I don't have an opinion on this. I'm just very curious to know what you think about it, though. Do our current antitrust laws allow companies to work together to create and expedite new antibiotics? And if not, if they do, those laws don't allow that, would an easing of the law prove beneficial, do you think?
Sir, I will give you an example of where we actually have used the authority given to BARDA for antitrust exemption, and we actually used this with the development of the H5N1 and the H1N1 vaccines. It was very important that we have that. Certainly, in our case, we could actually use that and actually provide our sister agencies with to be there also, which we normally do.
Would you? Dr. Woodcock?
I have worked in public-private partnerships where we have gotten companies together to advance general societal goals, and they've had to be extremely lawyer-intensive on the antitrust issue. So there's no doubt, I think, that it's a barrier to working together to advance broader goals.
Great. Well, I think that's very, very helpful, and I appreciate your response. Mr. Chairman, you're pretty generous with that gavel. I will yield back 1 minute late.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been sitting here going over some of the FDA websites on this information. I know you have quite a public campaign, preserving our treasure, knowing an antibiotic works, et cetera. Have you measured the effectiveness of your campaigns in terms of working with the public and reducing their demands on physicians for antibiotics when it's not the appropriate medication?
I believe, especially the CDC's recent
campaign.
CDC's,
yes, CDC. It says CDC and FDA on the same sites, yes.
Did have an impact that was measured on reducing antibiotic use in sort of inappropriate conditions, yes.
Is that something we're going to see continued and expand? I mean, we've been talking a good bit about that today in terms of the kind of comments you've made and members have made. I'm just wondering if that is something that you see that we should continue to fund and push for a widespread public education campaign on that. And I might add, including the things you heard in my earlier commentary about the need for prevention. And I'm amazed sometimes I'll go into hospitals where you can't walk down the hall without someone being fairly militant and making you gown and glove and wash your hands, which is good. I've heard of rather dynamic things. I think to get in the ICU at University of Miami Medical Center, you don't push a button. There's not a sensor to censor the door. You have to put your hand under an alcohol dispenser, and then when it squirts in your hands, the door's open. A very clever idea. Or I've also heard of systems where doctors wear little monitors, or anybody, when they enter a room, if they have not washed their hands, a little mini alarm goes off and says, "Wash your hands, please." And then the chairman hits them with the gavel. Not true, sir. I'm continuing the theme here. But I'm just wondering about public education campaigns that we can do to reduce the need there.
I believe that's extraordinarily important, no matter what we do to the pipeline. And I think the last 20 years have showed us that. If there is indiscriminate use, then that will accelerate the development of resistance, and our pipeline will continue to have trouble getting getting ahead of that. The recent scientific emerging understanding about infection control and how effective these simple measures actually can be if they're rigorously followed, I think has startled a lot of people and provides a tremendous opportunity for improving quality in healthcare and decreasing infections, as you said. But each of those, I believe, need continued pressure and education and interest to perpetuate them, and they will go a long way toward dealing with this problem.
Well, I want to encourage all of you. I know when some of the recent flu outbreaks came out, you couldn't get into a bus stop without seeing a sign somewhere, and that was excellent. I thought it was very, very helpful. The second thing I wanted to ask about has to do with since when people are sick, they want to do something, and so there's a number of over-the-counter products, and either of you can answer this too, in terms of what we should be doing to help promote those for symptom assistance as opposed to the false promise of antibiotics for virus. Other things we should be doing to encourage more OTC products, over-the-counter products instead? Is that in any of your purview that you want to comment on that?
FDA regulates the over-the-counter drugs, and we certainly have, there's certainly a huge array of symptomatic control available for common viral illnesses that people suffer and also there are many other simple measures. So I think much of this is public education about the availability of straightforward symptomatic control for viral illnesses.
Dr. Bart, you have anything on that, Dr. Robinson?
I would concur with that also. I mean, we've had a number of different sponsors come to us for support looking at very simplistic type of products like that.
I might add, too, my editorial comments. I know that cuts to allow people to have their health care plan use their monies to pay for over-the-counter drugs. I don't like that idea, because here we're talking about the massive amount of money we have to put into research and prescribing costs for antibiotics that we're building resistance to, when we should be encouraging people to use other symptom remedies for that, and which are much less expensive and, of course, appropriate for those things, too. So I hope those are things that we will restore in the future, and I want to thank you both for your testimony. It's good to read this. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to be very brief. I just want to go back to what Chairman Pallone was talking about at the very first, and I touched on it in my opening statement. Our concern with the uncertainty that seems to exist at the FDA. And in my district in Tennessee, we have some wonderful groups that are doing tremendous amounts of research in biotherapies and in new therapies that are coming along the chain. We hear repeatedly about concern with the uncertainty from the FDA. You mentioned, Dr. Woodcock, that there has been a decline in the pipeline since 1987. And then we've also touched on the disincentives that are there. Dr. Robinson mentioned some of those. And I think that it is important that we realize those disincentives and the uncertainty at the FDA have a direct effect on what is there in that pipeline. And you keep saying, you've mentioned several times, you have the authority that is necessary, Dr. Woodcock, to finalize these documents and provide some certainty on that pathway. And I would just highlight with you that we think that that is important to do. If you have the authority, maybe you have too much authority. Maybe we need to pull some of that back in oversight and be just a little bit more direct and participatory in trying to help define that. But I would just highlight with you that it is of concern to us. We appreciate the work that you are doing, but we do have great concerns about the uncertainty and the disincentives and the decline in the pipeline. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you. And let me thank both of you for being here today. It was obviously very helpful to us in this sort of three-pronged effort here with 3 hearings to get to the bottom of some of these problems and what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll ask the second panel to come forward at this time. Let me introduce, well, first of all, welcome. And let me introduce the second panel. Starting to my left is Dr. Brad Spellberg, who is Associate Professor of Medicine, the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and a member of the Infectious Diseases Society of America Antimicrobial Availability Task Force. Second is Dr. Sandra Freihofer, who's from the Council on Science and Public Health at the American Medical Association. Then we have Dr. John Bradley, who's speaking on behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics. He's the chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases. He's with the Department of Pediatrics at the University of California School of Medicine, clinical director of the Division of Infectious Diseases, and he's also at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. That's a long list there. And then we have Dr. Barry Eisenstein, who is Senior Vice President of Scientific Affairs for Cubist Pharmaceuticals. I have to ask you, I keep looking at this Cubist. Is that just the drug that you, what does the Cubist refer to?
The microphone. We believe that medicine and science involved in drug development is both an art and a science.
Oh, so yeah, it's a reference to a cube, in other words. Okay, thank you. And last is Dr. Jeffrey Levy, who is Executive Director of the Trust for America's Health. He's testified many times before the committee. And I hope we did not contribute to your leg being broken or whatever happened to you.
But I know.
Are you? But thank you for being here today. So you know we have 5-minute opening statements that become part of the record, and then we may ask you, or you may submit additional written statements if you like. And we'll start with Dr. Spellberg.
Thank you. Could we cue up the slides, please?
Oh.
Great. Okay,
it's up
thanks
there?
a lot.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dr. Brad Spellberg. I'm an infectious disease specialist, as you said, at the UCLA School of Medicine and Harbor UCLA Medical Center. I'm also the author of Rising Plague, which is a book about the antibiotic crisis, and it's my honor today to be here representing the Infectious Diseases Society of America, which is an organization of more than 9,000 physicians, pharmacists, and scientists that all work in infectious diseases and microbiology. In 2004, the IDSA released the Bad Bugs, No Drugs white paper to inform the public and Congress about the looming antibiotic crisis. And more recently, just in the last couple of months, the IDSA has released the 10 by 20 initiative, which calls for the development of 10 new critically needed antibiotics by the year 2020. And the reason why we're here today and the reason why IDSA has released Bad Bugs, No Drugs and the 10 by 20 initiative is because we're here to advocate for our patients that are dying of infections and we're running out of drugs to throw at them. This graph shows the number of new systemic antibacterial agents approved by the FDA per 5-year period. The conclusion from this graph is inescapable. Antibiotic development is dying. And at the same time, we're witnessing skyrocketing incidences of multi-drug resistant bacterial infections of a variety of types, some of which are shown on this graph, but there are many other types as well. This, of course, creates a critical need for new antibiotics to be developed right at the time when new antibiotics are not being developed. And these infections hit hospitalized patients, infirm patients, sick patients, the elderly, but they also hit the healthiest and strongest among us. In particular, our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan have been devastated by a wide variety of multi-drug resistant bacterial infections. And this highlights a central point, which is that everyone is at risk for these infections, including healthy people in communities. And shown on this slide are examples of real patients who are healthy in communities and have been killed or maimed by multi-drug resistant bacterial infections. Everyone is at risk. The collective toll of these infections in terms of number of people infected, number killed, and the multi-billions of dollars per year that these infections cost our healthcare systems is absolutely staggering. We have to start thinking of antibiotics as a precious limited resource. In the same way that we view forestry, fisheries, and energy policy, we need to both conserve and restore this precious resource, and currently we do neither. We overuse and waste our antibiotics in both humans and animals. And the antibiotic resource is not being restored because, as we've heard, both there is an economic disincentive because antibiotics are not economically competitive with other drugs, and there are regulatory barriers that prevent companies from understanding how to do clinical trials to get antibiotics approved. So we need a multi-pronged approach to solving these problems, as we've heard. We need a multi-pronged approach to promoting antibiotic conservation. We need much better, more effective, and widespread antibiotic stewardship programs to be used all over the country and, frankly, throughout the world. We need funding to be made available to CDC and others to develop and spread these stewardship programs. We do need to promote the development and use of rapid diagnostics to empower physicians to more accurately prescribe antibiotics. And finally, we need to pass the STAR Act, which will give us federal oversight and create the infrastructure necessary to gather the data we need to understand the scope of the antibiotic resistance problem in this country. We also need a multi-pronged approach to promoting antibiotic restoration. We need to establish orphan drug-like economic push and pull incentives to rekindle interest in industry in antibiotic R&D. We need to increase funding to relevant federal agencies like NIH, like BARDA, and we should really start thinking seriously about establishing a nonprofit public-private partnership whose mission is to develop critically needed small market molecules to treat life-threatening infections caused by resistant bacteria. And finally, we need to continue to promote regulatory clarity at the FDA for existing pathways and also to create new pathways to create critically needed antibiotics that have not been developed previously. I'm going to close with a brief anecdote. Dr. Burgess, Congressman Burgess, mentioned penicillin. I want to go back to the beginning of the penicillin era to remind all of us how important it is that we have effective antibiotics. So I'm going to tell you the true story of a 4-year-old girl in late 1942 who had been in perfect health until she suddenly developed an infection on her face, a skin infection. This progressed relentlessly. Her face and neck became so swollen she could not swallow her own saliva, and it was when she began gasping for breath that her parents, in a panic, rushed her to the Mayo Clinic. And this is what this little girl looked like on arrival to the hospital. Her parents were told that she would be dead within 2 days and there wasn't anything anybody could do to stop it. Imagine being told that about your 4-year-old that 4 days earlier had been in perfect health. But she was lucky because Dr. Harrell at the Mayo Clinic was one of the very few people in the United States that had access to penicillin before the end of World War II. He went to his laboratory, he grabbed some doses of penicillin, and he began treating her. And this is what this little girl looked like at the end of a few days of penicillin therapy. Antibiotics are the only medical intervention that can take a patient that looks as sick as this little girl did on arrival to the hospital and turn them into somebody as well as she looked when she was discharged from the hospital a few days later. To my understanding, from what I am told, this little girl is alive and well today and still receives her care at the Mayo Clinic. Penicillin has given her a 7-decade lease on life and counting. So this is my final slide. Prior generations have given us the gift of antibiotics, and today we have a moral obligation to ensure that antibiotics continue to be available for our children and future generations. The time for debate has passed. The time for action is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spellberg. Dr. Freihofer?
Good morning. Or is it afternoon now? Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Shimkus, and other members of the subcommittee, I'm Dr. Sandra Adamson Freihofer. I'm a general internist in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a clinical associate professor of medicine at Emory University School of Medicine. I'm a member of the American Medical Association's Council on Science and Public Health, and I'm pleased to testify today on behalf of the AMA about antibiotics and the growing threat of antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics are miracle drugs, but many are beginning to lose their luster. Antibiotic resistance is now a major public health concern. Take MRSA, for example, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. You can think of MRSA as a rogue staph infection The bacteria is smarter, so traditional antibiotics in the methicillin family can't kill it. MRSA infections aren't new. The new trend is where we're seeing them. They used to be seen only in hospital settings, but now we're seeing these infections in the community and in otherwise healthy young people, including athletes. The AMA believes that in order to reverse these trends requires a multifaceted approach. Reduce inappropriate use of existing antibiotics, incentivize research and development in order to create new antibiotics, and finally, encourage alternatives to reduce our dependence on antibiotics, and one such alternative is vaccines. Inappropriate use of antibiotics. Why is this important? Increasing rates of drug-resistant invasive infections correlate directly with increases in antibiotic overuse. Decreasing inappropriate use of antibiotics can reduce the prevalence of antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections or superbugs. Continued physician education about this issue is key. The AMA has sponsored many educational conferences. We've developed and disseminated educational tools, including one specifically focusing on MRSA. We've issued scientific reports on antibiotic resistance. We've also supported the CDC's campaign to prevent antimicrobial resistance in healthcare settings. The Physician Consortium for Performance Improvement, called PCPI, was convened by the AMA. Now, this group is dedicated to improving patient health, safety, and quality of care. PCPI develops evidence-based clinical performance measures, and they've already developed one for managing ear infections in children, and they're in the early stages of developing one for managing sinus infections in adults. Next, patient education must also be a part of this solution. One of the main reasons that physicians prescribe unnecessary antibiotics is patients want them and some of them demand them. The AMA helped launch the CDC's Get Smart public education campaign on why physicians should not prescribe antibiotics for the common cold. The AMA has been involved in several media briefings about antibiotic resistance, and hopefully as mainstream media gives more attention to this issue, our patients may become more accepting of why they don't need an antibiotic. Now, we've talked a lot today about use of antibiotics in the healthcare setting, but use of antibiotics in agriculture and in animal husbandry also contributes to antibiotic resistance. The AMA is opposed to use of antibiotics at non-therapeutic levels in agriculture or as growth promoters, and urges that such use be terminated or phased out based on sound scientific risk assessments. Another part of the solution is we need new antibiotics, especially now that many of the ones we have no longer work. This means fostering and incentivizing new research and development. The AMA has supported the call to action you just heard about, the bad bugs, no drugs, and another new initiative that Dr. Spellman told us about, the 10 by 20, is very exciting. This initiative will be considered by endorsement by the American Medical Association at our annual meeting later this week. So patient education, physician education, new antibiotics. We also need to look for innovative ways to reduce our dependence on antibiotics. One way of staving off infection is through vaccines, and the development of new vaccines against resistant bugs like toxigenic E. coli, for example, should be encouraged. However, vaccines only work if people get them. We have vaccines available that boost immunity to deadly strains of pneumococcal infection. But even in this era of ever-increasing antibiotic resistance, immunization rates against pneumococcal infection remain low in adults. In summary, the American Medical Association is committed to getting antibiotic resistance under control, and we are making some headway. CDC data over the last 10 years shows a 20% decrease in use of antibiotics to treat upper respiratory infections, and a 13% decrease in prescribing antibiotics overall for all office visits. The American Medical Association will continue to support these efforts, and we appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Bradley?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure to be here today to share some information with you about children. My name's John Bradley. I'm a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, or the AAP, which is a nonprofit professional organization of more than 60,000 primary care pediatricians, pediatric medical subspecialists, and pediatric surgical specialists dedicated to the health, safety, and well-being of infants, children, and adolescents. I'm a member of the Academy's Committee on Infectious Disease, and with Dr. Spellberg, the IDSA's Task Force on Antimicrobial Drug Availability. My oral testimony this morning is going to focus specifically on the challenges of antibiotic resistance in children. The successful treatment of infections in children requires the availability of safe and effective antimicrobial therapy, and especially for children, I emphasize both safe and effective. Antimicrobials are among the most commonly prescribed drugs in children, but the appropriate use of antibiotics in the treatment of true infections, and kids do get otitis media and strep throat, combined with the inappropriate use of antibiotics, has led to the development of resistance. This resistance has had a significant impact on our ability to treat children in both clinics and in hospitals. Antibiotic choices for treatment of infections are more limited for children than adults. However, we have the same critical need for new antibiotics in children as is present in adults, as these same antibiotic-resistant organisms that cause infections in adults cause infections in children who are hospitalized. However, for most of the newer, more potent antibiotics approved for adults over the past 5 to 10 years, inadequate information exists on the safety and efficacy of these antibiotics in newborns, infants, and children, but we're using them anyway because we have to. Please consider the following specific pediatric issues. First, children are uniquely vulnerable to infections. Newborn infants, particularly premature infants who are now surviving with birth weights of only 1 pound, babies only this large, have horribly suppressed immunity that's a necessary component of survival during growth in the womb. In addition, all children up to age 2 years have immature immune systems and are particularly susceptible to bacterial bloodstream infections and spinal meningitis. Further, many infants have anatomic or genetic abnormalities that increase their susceptibility to infection, and many of these children die of infections during childhood, so my colleagues who care for adults have never taken care of these children or watched them die. Second, the safety of drugs is a critical factor for children, a population that the FDA and human research committees recognize as vulnerable. Drug toxicity, such as irritation or damage to the brain, heart, bones, or joints, may last a lifetime. Third, damage from the infection itself may last a lifetime, particularly if the wrong antibiotic is used for the treatment of an antibiotic-resistant organism. Fourth, children are incredibly efficient at spreading infections. Not only do they cough, sneeze, and drool over each other, but they spread infection to siblings, parents, and grandparents.
Oh, yeah.
Diarrhea is a scourge of daycare centers. Clean diaper-changing facilities and sinks are critical, but are often lacking, and the CDC and public health departments around the country have documented many outbreaks of bacterial infections in infants caused by increasingly resistant bacteria, as we reported in our written testimony. Antibiotic resistance is a serious problem in children, and the AAP has worked for over a decade to teach pediatricians and families about judicious use of antibiotics, beginning in earnest in 1998 with our collaboration with the CDC and a series of articles published in our official medical journal called Pediatrics. We have shared CDC materials, we've created AAP materials to distribute to our members and to the families they care for, and to emphasize over and over again the importance of appropriate use. One toddler in a daycare center who receives inappropriate therapy leading to the development of resistant bacteria can spread that organism to classmates and family members, making treatment of both the child and the contacts, including adults, more difficult. We know this, and we're committed to programs to enhance appropriate use to decrease resistance. Just like our colleagues in adult medicine, we're running out of antibiotics for these multi-resistant bacteria, and in our written testimony, we provide a current reference to a journal article describing the deaths of 4 out of 7 premature infants who were exposed to an antibiotic-resistant strain of Acinetobacter, the gram-negative bacteria that's coming back from Iran and Iraq in our soldiers. A vaccination is another critical component of combating the spread and severity of antimicrobial resistance infections, and the AAP has taken pride in being the professional pediatric organization that has developed and promoted an immunization schedule for all children in the United States for the past 72 years. Universal immunization of children for pneumococcus, an antibiotic-resistant bacteria that infects the respiratory tract, causes ear infections and pneumonia, has actually decreased antibiotic resistance in invasive infections in both children and adults, as immunization prevents this resistant bacteria from living in the nose and throat of immunized children, therefore limiting the spread of these bacteria to adults who kiss them and share food with them. In summary, antibiotic resistance is a moving target and requires ongoing intense commitments to develop better surveillance tools, better vaccines, and better antibiotics. We support the initiatives that were presented by Dr. Spellberg from the IDSA, and notably H.R. 2400, or the STAR Act, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, and the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act have helped us tremendously, encouraging pharmaceutical industry to develop information on pediatrics that they ordinarily would not have done. I have just a few slides that I'd like to show of premature infants here, just to give you an idea of how small and frail they are, and some of the slides that I wish to show.
Dr. Bradley, I know you're like a minute and a half over, so.
I'm sorry.
No, we'll
I'll
just show us the slides and then we'll
Yes,
move
sir.
on.
This is a gut infection in a newborn infant, resistance. This is MRSA destroying the lung, and Dr. Spellberg showed the picture of this child who's posted on the IDSA website. This is a child with who had open heart surgery for congenital heart disease and is now on a lung bypass machine. And he's such a setup for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Thank you. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify.
Sure. Dr. Eisenstein?
Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the urgent need to spur greater innovation and accelerate the development of new therapeutics to combat the threat of antimicrobial-resistant bacterial infections. I am Dr. Barry Eisenstein, Senior Vice President, Scientific Affairs at Cubist Pharmaceuticals. Cubist is a biopharmaceutical company headquartered in Lexington, Massachusetts. We currently market Cubicin, also known as daptomycin for injection, a first-line intravenous antibiotic against methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA, and other gram-positive infections, as well as Staph aureus blood infections. Cubist has a growing pipeline of antibiotic candidates against other resistant and difficult-to-treat infections. We believe antimicrobial resistance is a public health crisis. You have already received testimony from the CDC, NIH, FDA, BARDA, and today the IDSA, AMA, and AAP, combined with numerous independent studies, is unanimous on two key points. First, antibiotic resistance is an increasingly severe threat to our public health. And second, that gaps in our therapeutic options are growing rapidly by the month, making it urgent that we develop more drugs, more new drugs, to develop resistant infections. We are approaching a crisis point with antibiotic resistance and the lack of new drugs against gram-positive bacteria such as staph, gram-negative bacteria such as Acinetobacter. Mr. Chairman, you yourself noted in the subcommittee's last hearing that gram-negative infections have become a significant health issue for many servicemen and servicewomen returning from the Middle East with untreatable infections. So why so few antibiotics in development? There are critical economic disincentives at work that profoundly and adversely impact the willingness of companies and others to pursue cutting-edge antimicrobial R&D. As you have heard, the number of new antibiotics approved by the FDA has decreased by 70% since the mid-1980s, and a recent peer-review study found only 5 new antibiotics in the R&D pipeline out of more than 506 in development, less than 1%. But proven incentives exist to encourage antimicrobial innovation. 3 years ago, with your leadership, a provision in FDAA required FDA to answer whether the Orphan Drug Act could be applied in this manner. Regrettably, the agency concluded that they cannot under the law as written. Despite this setback, like you, Cubis believes there's still options available. We commend IDSA for their 10 by 20 initiative, and we strongly support enactment of H.R. 2400, the STAR Act. But we believe that neither the 10 by 20 nor STAR Act includes provisions that would directly encourage development of new therapeutics. As one of the very few American companies discovering and commercializing novel anti-infectives, we believe that incentives must attract more small, mid-market, and large companies into pursuing both human clinical studies and earlier stage research. Congress and the administration need to make correct market failures, just as they have already for rare diseases, pediatric drug use, and medical countermeasures. I believe such incentives must include the following. 1, enhance market and data exclusivity for qualified infectious disease products. 2, exempt qualified infectious disease products from the pharmaceutical excise tax and 340B drug discount expansion enacted in health reform. 3, authorize the study and establishment of guaranteed market contracts and other pull market mechanisms, as well as the use of other transactions authority by the HHS. 4, expand tropical disease priority review vouchers as established under FDAA to apply to qualified infectious disease products. 5, create infectious disease product development grants modeled on FDA's successful orphan product development grants. 6, codify the Task Force on Global Antimicrobial Resistance. And 7, improve access to home infusion antibiotic treatment, especially in the Medicare program. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Antimicrobial resistance is a very real threat to public health and one that is only getting worse. I urge Congress to act on the consensus recommendations that I and many others offer as steps towards assuring the development of the next generation of first-line drugs to combat resistant infections.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenstein. Dr. Levy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Shimkus.
I think you have to either move it closer or press the button or both.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Shimkus. I'm Jeff Levy. I'm the Executive Director of Trust for America's Health. We're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan public health advocacy organization. Antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, is not an abstract concern. As we've heard, we live in a world where antibiotic resistance is believed to be responsible for over 90,000 deaths a year in the United States. That's more than die of diabetes or Alzheimer's or HIV. And AMR poses a totally unnecessary burden on the U.S. healthcare system. We face this problem in part because the market has failed to meet the need for new antimicrobials. In my oral testimony, I'm going to focus on the primary research and development questions that I think we need to do to address this market failure. But my written testimony also discusses two other critical components to this effort, and that is federal leadership and prevention. And I'd like to briefly comment on those first. First, the administration has taken a major step forward in creating a new locus for leadership regarding AMR by establishing the new position of Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health in Infectious Diseases. This new leadership, we hope, will provide the development and oversee the updated Public Health Action Plan to combat antimicrobial resistance, and that this will be a robust and comprehensive plan that addresses the many issues outlined in the testimony you are hearing today. Until we develop new antimicrobial agents, we must depend on prevention. While much has been started, we hope that the administration will embrace a far more aggressive national education campaign about appropriate use of antimicrobials and non-pharmaceutical approaches to prevent transmission of resistant bacteria. Above all, we hope the administration will step back from its proposed cut of $8.6 million in funding for state and local health departments to track and control antibiotic resistance. Ultimately, the problem of antimicrobial resistance will not be resolved until we have better diagnostics, new antimicrobial agents, and new vaccines. But few new products are in the pipeline, as we've heard. This is primarily because the market has failed. We need to change that equation. To date, the largest federal investment in creating market incentives is through BARDA. Unfortunately, while BARDA has the authority to do the research we need to do, it is chronically underfunded. Even the proposed $476 million budget for fiscal 2011 for BARDA is a fraction of what BARDA needs to incentivize development of a range of countermeasures, not just antimicrobials. With scarce funding, the federal government has been unable to demonstrate to industry that they will be full partners. The existing options beyond BARDA, including potential expansion of the Orphan Drug Act, prioritization of vouchers for companies that focus on neglected tropical diseases, and advanced purchase arrangements, are all necessary, but we believe probably insufficient to create the research and manufacturing capacity and/or the demand for developing new antimicrobial agents. These financial and regulatory incentives may continue to attract small companies, but we worry that they will not attract the larger companies with the manufacturing and marketing capacity to bring new antimicrobial products to scale. Even if we successfully address the market issues, we still need policies and programs that will also create the intellectual capital in the academic and private sector-based biomedical research community if we are to answer the range of basic research questions and then develop new products. In short, I think we're left with more questions than answers, and so we need a collaborative effort between the private sector and the public sector, and I hope it will be reflected in the forthcoming action plan and that it can address some of the following questions. What is the right mix of direct financial incentives and regulatory protections to bring new companies to the table? What policies and incentives can the government create that will result in a willingness of venture capital to invest in development of new antimicrobial agents? Government financing alone does not need to be the answer. We have begun to see venture capital playing a role in development of new influenza-related products. Can we learn from this experience and bring more players to the table? What investments does the NIH need to make to incentivize biomedical researchers to re-engage with the field of antimicrobial development so they see a long-term future in this field? What policies can FDA put in place in advance so the potential investors in research know the pathway to approval? And finally, and just as important, what policy and financial arrangements will assure that new products developed with special federal financial support or regulatory incentives will be accessible and affordable to domestic consumers, reflecting the taxpayers' early investment in their development. Any plan should come with a professional judgment budget so that the Congress and the administration can make appropriate estimates of the potential return on an increased federal investment. If the HHS plan fails to address these issues properly, an independent entity should be empowered to develop that plan. AMR is a solvable problem if we are creative enough in our policies and our investment strategies. As the bugs adapt, so must we. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our views today.
Thank you, Dr. Levy, and let me thank all of you. As you know, we're going to take questions now, and I'll start with myself. Some of you mentioned that antibiotics are unique among drugs because the more they're used, the less effective they become. So in order to preserve their effectiveness, they need to be used infrequently. That's a very different situation from drugs used, for example, to treat a rare cancer. Yet even with these differences, a couple of you suggested that we should look at extending the market exclusivity provided to antibiotics like we did with the Orphan Drug Act. And exclusivity, of course, delays generic competition and deprives patients and the overall healthcare system of the critical savings they provide. You know, we're always worried about saving money around here. So if we're going to consider this kind of incentive, we need to have every confidence that it's justified and that will work. So let me ask those of you who address this, beginning with Dr. Eisenstein, if you can explain how adding 6 months or even 2 years of exclusive marketing would result in companies investing in antibiotic development, when, as I mentioned, the only way to preserve an antibiotic's effectiveness is to minimize its use. You understand, it seems a little disingenuous. In other words, during the period of exclusive marketing, the public health goal would be to minimize use of the drug and thus minimize its sale. So under those circumstances, why would additional market exclusivity be a successful inducement for antibiotic development? I'm confused, and how do you juxtapose those two?
I think you're talking about really two answers to the same problem, the problem that we've heard today about antibiotic resistance. And as has been, I'm not an economist, but as has been explained to me from smart economists who've looked at this, there's an issue of supply and an issue of demand. The issues of demand have been very well discussed by the panelists here today, I believe, in terms of things like antimicrobial stewardship, which, by the way, I, as a physician working at a pharmaceutical company, strongly subscribe to and agree with. What this means is that a given company, like Cubist, would actually forego profits that it might otherwise be able to get if it were not selling antimicrobials, if it were selling some other product. So to make up for that, because of the otherwise perverse aspect that controlling the demand side is perversely then hurting the supply side by providing that extra disincentive, you give back to the company extra time to regain the investment that they've made previously, albeit it's several more years out.
Right, but I guess what I'm asking,
it's not on the same level.
Maybe you've answered this, but maybe I don't understand. I understand that, but I mean, what about this other factor, which is that, you know, you have this health goal to minimize use as a drug, and doesn't that mean minimize its sale? So how do you address that in the context of the market exclusivity?
Well, again, market exclusivity would provide the innovative company with a longer launch pad to
So the fact that they were trying to minimize its use as a public health goal wouldn't be as significant? Because you have a longer period of time.
It would tend to balance that out, and that's how you give back for the degree of control at the front end. All
right, I want to ask two more, and I'm going to be quick here. Dr. Spelberg, you think 15 to 20 years of exclusivity is necessary. Now, that far exceeds any other terms of market protection that we have in place today, so why do you give us such a long period? Unless I misunderstood. I thought you said 15 to 20 years.
So from my understanding, the current orphan drug, if you can apply the orphan drug to a product, it's 7 years. Is that right, Bob?
Yeah, and we have others. I think, you know, we just did what in healthcare reform we did for generic follow-on biologics. I think that was 14 or maybe 12, but you're at 15 to 20.
Well, yeah, I think this was just the concept that we're in really bad shape with antibiotics and we have to do something potent to fix it. And I think one of the really important central concepts that IDSA believes is that there isn't going to be one incentive that fixes this problem. There's going to be a panel of them. And whatever panel is felt to be most fiscally responsible and effective is fine. I mean,
so it's one of the pieces.
Exactly.
And that's sort of what Dr. Levy said, so I'll end with you. You expressed skepticism about whether exclusivity would work, and I think you did give us a whole, you know, panoply. So would just give me a little more information about why you have questions of exclusivity and how important that is by comparison to some of the other things you mentioned.
I'm not sure I know the answer to what is the right balance.
Yeah, I know none of us do, but I'd like your opinion.
Yeah, but I think market exclusivity plays a role. But I think we are not entirely clear about how major a role, how much of an incentive it's going to be. And I think we have this very, you know, strange situation where, on the one hand, we want to discourage use, which even with some additional exclusivity, will that be enough to bring big manufacturers to the table? And that's what we really need. We need both the intellectual capital that these big companies have and the production and marketing capacity that they have. If it is dramatically successful and becomes a new major antibiotic, we wouldn't necessarily, we may want prudent use, but it may then have a very large market that goes beyond what was ever intended in the Orphan Drug Act. So I think we have to try to figure out what that right balance is. And I guess I have to come back to my bottom line as to why all these questions still remain is that we haven't invested the money that it's going to take. And a lot of this is going to take federal dollars. And you know, we have the authority in agencies like BARDA to promote this development, and I think industry feels this is a much improved process, but we haven't put enough resources into it. We've put a fraction of the resources into it to even develop the products that are already on the agenda that BARDA has, and so it's going to take a significant mix. Just one last thought, which is once we make those federal investments, we need to make sure that these are indeed accessible to consumers and that the federal government doesn't pay twice. So that I would suggest that the 340B program is actually very important. If we're subsidizing care for people, if we're paying for, whether it's through Medicaid or the community health centers, If the federal government is paying for the direct care, we shouldn't be paying for it twice if we've already invested in the development of those products.
All right, thank you. Mr. Shimkus?
Wow, so many questions, so little time, all the doctors at the table, and I've learned a couple things from listening to testimony and perusing. This is serious business, and I just don't know if we are serious about it yet. So I think you're helpful in the testimony. Some of you like the STAR Act, and the STAR Man's here, so I'm going to talk with him about it. But also some of you said it's not enough, so there's probably some building that has to be done, and I look forward to working with Congressman Matheson, who's a good friend and an honest broker, which I think you need in this business. Dr. Levy, and I'm just making comments, and I'm going to try to get the questions, but you mentioned market failure, and I think the chart in both testimonies shows that we don't have any. And I don't know if Dr. Woodcock mentioned this small little uptick, if this was really just Pollyannish or, you know, trying to feed us some optimism based upon FDA. But I think there needs to be a discussion of market failure or government failure, that there may be both here. And that's where I'm going to encourage you all to continue to talk. If we really believe the seriousness of the problem, we can get to a solution. But we all have to be working together, and we'll develop a consensus. And so I think there's hope for that, because we've had successes in marketing new drugs, from pediatric exclusivity to other things, what we've done on the biologics, and we've done this stuff. So there are things that we can do. I've stayed off beating up my friends on the new health care law, and also some panelists here. And so my intent is not to do that, but I do think it's, Dr. Eisenstein, you did mention that the excise tax on pharmaceuticals in your testimony, one of your solutions is we need to get relief from that as an incentive, which if you then go on to take it to its natural conclusion, which means that the excise test must be an inhibitor to certainty or return on investment or something to the pharmaceutical practices, which is also was mentioned was the President's fiscal year 11 $8.6 million cut in preventive and education, which I think a lot of people don't talk about it. Or what was highlighted in the last panel also was, if we want to move people off antibiotics, we want to move them to, and this was Congressman Murphy's point, he's not here right now, but we want to move them away out of prescriptive antibiotics, so we should want to encourage them initially to do over-the-counter. But what we did in the health care law was, for flexible spending accounts, was disincentivize people using over-the-counter. In fact, we took away their ability to use their flexible spending accounts to do that. So I ended up walking away again having more questions than answers. And some of the questions I kind of already mentioned based upon the statements. Does anyone want to, I guess let me just finish with a question with Dr. Spellberg, if I may. In your testimony, you comment, we talked about this pipeline and development. Do you buy, I mean, you sat in here, and Dr. Woodcock left, and she was here for most of the testimony, which I have great respect for. Do you buy their arguments that they're doing all they can and there's a little uptick? Or you heard me ask them about regulatory authority. Do they need more? Really didn't get any answer. So they seem to think they have the power to move forward, but I've got a feeling that you're not convinced.
Well, let me start by saying that I think all of us at ESA are very appreciative of the tremendous energy and effort that Dr. Cox, Dr. Woodcock, and the new leadership under Dr. Hamburg and Sharfstein have infused into the agency. Just in the last year or two, we've seen a tremendous uptick of energy and efficiency and work product output. We've been asking for guidance documents for years on these diseases, and we're finally starting to get some. I don't think that they need more statutory authority. I think that there's two issues that I would raise with Dr. Woodcock's testimony. First is that it is not true that companies have a clear path to approval for superiority drugs. I consult for companies that develop antibiotics. They don't know how to do those studies. Those studies have never been done before. It may be philosophically true that that's an open path, but for something that's never been done before, companies are not going to take a risk on hundreds of millions of dollars of capital invested to do a trial that's never been done before. They want to go to tried and true pathways. So we think that we need guidance documents to do those studies. The superiority studies for highly drug-resistant bacteria do not exist. There is no pathway for that. And we need guidance on that, one. Two, I think the issue with the non-inferiority studies that Dr. Woodcock mentioned, I don't think that there is, I would not personally characterize it as scientific controversy. What there is statistical controversy. If you talk to the physicians and the investigators who do these studies, there is pretty clear consensus on how, what these studies should look like. And when you look at the advisory committee panel votes, it's split, clinicians, scientists, and statisticians. So I would personally go back to Samuel Clemens. There's three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think statistics are very valuable, but when you start to weigh them more heavily than clinical reality, I think that's a problem. And I'd like to see a philosophical balance. I think this is a philosophical problem, not a scientific problem at the FDA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to apologize to the rest of the panelists for not asking follow-up questions, but you can tell I was listening, and I took in a lot of information. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Next is he's been characterized as our star, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been called a lot worse, so I'll take the positive descriptions when I get them. I want to thank the panel. I'm sorry I've been bouncing between two hearings, so I'm trying to be in two places at once. But I do appreciate the panel being here, appreciate your insight and your indicated support for what we're trying to do with the STAR Act. And Mr. Shimkus, I agree. There's always room to look for improvements, and I'm always trying to be an honest broker, and that's why we hold these hearings, to get more information, and we want to do the best we can. Sometimes process does help if you go through the process, and so I hope we can continue to do that on this issue. And want to acknowledge Dr. Spellberg. You participated in a briefing just last month for congressional staff that I think helped highlight this issue, and it's good to see you again, and I appreciate your engagement on the issue. And both Dr. Spellberg and Dr. Bradley, I appreciate you bringing some examples of where how infectious disease and disease-resistant disease-resistant bugs have caused some problems for actual patients, because ultimately that's what we're talking about, the patients. And I have a bias because my wife's a pediatric infectious disease doc as well at the Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City. So this is an important issue for me, and that's why I've tried to get engaged in this legislation. Dr. Spellberg, let me ask you just a couple of questions. How often are you seeing in your practice, are you finding patients with resistant infections? And are you seeing a trend that's going in an upward way?
Yeah, so I'm an academic hospitalist. My patient care is inpatient.
Right.
And we encounter multi-drug resistant bacteria daily, every day on rounds. And I'll just give you an example. Over a 1-month period at my institution, we had 23 patients that were infected with extreme drug-resistant Acinetobacter that's resistant to everything except one last-ditch drug, colistin, which was abandoned in the 60s because it's so toxic. And that's all we have left. 23 patients in 1 month for one bacteria. That's the scope of the problem.
And that was your last hope, that one medication?
Yeah, that's it. And I should also mention, we don't routinely test for susceptibility to that drug. So we don't know, some of those 23 patients may have been resistant to it as well. Yeah. We don't know. Yeah. Getting back to the STAR Act, we need data collection to know what the extent of the resistance problem is.
Right. Part of the STAR Act is it does create this, we call it the Public Health Antimicrobial Advisory Board. And it's going to include infectious disease experts, public health, pharmacy, veterinary, other experts to provide sort of advice to this interagency task force to try to bring some accountability to federal efforts. Do you think that, how do you think that type of advisory board is going to benefit HHS and benefit this issue?
I think there's at least two really important reasons why we need that advisory board. One is that this stuff is very complex, and it takes a tremendous amount of very broad scientific expertise. I think it's unrealistic to expect that one government agency is going to have that breadth of expertise. An external advisory panel can bring a very broad and deep expertise to oversee the issue. The second issue is that an external board can help hold the feet to the fire, help make sure that goals are met, provide some accountability externally.
Mm-hmm. In your practice, when you well, you say you're at an academic hospital, teaching hospital. So, in terms of your involvement with looking for development of new meds, new antibiotics that can address these tougher bugs, we have a lot of discussion today about the available incentives to encourage the research and development. Do you think the existing incentives, there are some that are working and not working, in addition to what we ought to add in the future, but are there some efforts we try to do to encourage development of new meds that just aren't getting any traction at all?
Yeah, I don't think we have any existing mechanisms that apply to antibiotics. We have tried to access the orphan drug program. It's been made very clear, explicitly clear, that the orphan drug program does not apply to antibiotics for whatever reason. We need orphan drug-like mechanisms. There is no existing incentive mechanism to bring companies back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I don't know.
That's okay.
Directly related.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thanks.
Would the gentleman just yield to follow up on that?
Yeah.
And the orphan drug is because of the, does anyone, because of the population of 200,000, is that basically why the FDA is saying that the orphan drug does not qualify? And since these are bacteria, they don't know the population?
You know, I think we could very much quibble with the fact that there are, you know...
Is this statistical stuff that you were talking about on my question?
I don't understand the exact reasons why the FDA counts the numbers as being more than 200,000. If we talk about all bacterial infections, certainly it's more than 200,000. If we talk about extreme drug-resistant Acinetobacter, it can't be more than 200,000. But either way, fine. If we can't access orphan drug, let's look at other push-pull mechanisms, and let's look at, you know, increasing funding at NIH so that we can get better science to lead target discovery and establish a clinical trials network. And there's lots of other things we could be doing.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't tell you how refreshing it is to have a panel where 4 of the 5 panelists are MDs. You know, we did the health care bill and all the hearings leading up to that. We just heard from economists and political scientists and theoretical folks. It would have been great to have you guys here while we were actually doing that work. But you're here today, and I appreciate the fact you are. Dr. Bradley, Dr. Spellberg, you guys took me back to the 1970s when I was in medical school, and on the pediatric wards, the pediatric attending told us that let's use kanamycin because we're saving gentamicin for the days that it will become, when kanamycin will no longer be effective. And then Dr. Spellberg, when I did an elective in infectious disease, I was told by the professor, why did you pick kanamycin for this child? And I said, well, because we're saving gentamicin. He said, well, you need to go down and talk to the orthopedist because they're not saving it right now. They're using it on anybody who walks in the door, which just, that's part of the problem because it's, you know, it's like our air quality issues. They don't live in a single jurisdiction. They tend to migrate throughout society. But the 10 by 20 issue, Dr. Spellberg, you heard me questioning Dr. Woodcock from the FDA, and the new molecular entities in the last decade have been about 10. So is 10 by 20 really just, are we just talking about the status quo with development of new stuff, or is 10 by 20 really a breakthrough?
You're talking about 10 new molecular entities on a declining scale. So if you look at the last 5 years, it's way less than that. If we got 10 new meaningful drugs to treat really resistant bacteria by the year 2020, that would be a dramatic improvement from where we are right now. Do I think one drug per year is enough in the long term? Probably not. But if each of those drugs is a meaningful advance, it's not a Me Too drug, then 1 to 2 per year in the long run is probably enough to get us where we need to go.
Yeah, let me interrupt you because, you know, again, they're just the devil on me with the gavel in this committee. What are some of the new things that are out there? What have you got in the pipeline? Tease us with what's over the horizon here. What are we going to be able to treat?
To be honest with you, first of all, let's remember that if we're lucky, 1 in 5 antibiotics in the pipeline is going to get approved. When you talk about the pipeline, you're talking about late preclinical, early phase 1 clinical trials, and maybe as bad as 1 in 10. So if you have 15 antibiotics in the pipeline, which is what the IDSA and the European Centers for Disease Control and EMEA identified, we're going to be lucky to have 2, maybe 3 of those drugs get approved in the next 5 to 10 years or so.
Well, you know, you talked quite passionately and eloquently about the need for funding, and I don't disagree with that. But 15 months ago, we passed an enormous bill. It was called a stimulus bill. We pumped so much money into NIH. I mean, we thought they were going to pop. And now, how do you get those discoveries into the hands of clinicians if we've got this pipeline problem at the FDA?
Well, I think you've got 2 problems there. One is putting money into NIH, and we are calling for $500 million to go into NIAID specifically, is not enough. We need that money to go to the critical areas. And in our analysis with NIAID's help, the vast majority of the dollars they spent on antimicrobial resistance is not spent on solving multi-drug resistant bacteria. It's primarily spent on things like HIV and tuberculosis. We need to have that money go to lead compound, discover new lead molecules that are going to treat multi-resistant infections. A tiny fraction of that money goes there. The other thing is, in discussions with Dr. Woodcock, we need a clinical trial network so that very sophisticated clinical trials can get done that will open up the antibiotic pipeline during clinical development. And we'd like to see public-private partnerships, large grants that bring together academia and industry to help solve these problems.
Well, after all, that was the penicillin story, because
That's exactly
your 1942 pictures, however dramatic they are, that was only a handful of patients who could be treated at that time, and it was not until the deep fermentation process occurred toward the end of the Second World War that it became clinically efficacious to treat large numbers of people, and that was the story of D-Day, saving life and limb when they stormed the beaches at Normandy. Dr. Freihofer, I just have to ask you a question about the health care bill, because after all, your organization supported it. I'm a member of the AMA. I did not support. I voted against it. But on the issue of Class 2 medical devices, and we're going to get, you are going to get hit. Your members are going to get hit with a significant tax on Class 2 medical devices in physician offices. Syringes, needles will be taxed, and I think it's 2.9%. That's going to be a hard cost to pass on to the patient, to the consumer, because you're under contractual arrangement with the insurance companies. And it's not likely that they're going to pick up the cost of that tax. Well, what about some of these point of diagnosis tests that have been talked about? The tests are being developed by BARDA, and some of the tests that Dr. Woodcock from the FDA talked about. Those tests are they not going to be classified as Class 2 and Class 3
Dr. Burgess,
devices?
why don't we do this, Dr. Burgess? Your time's run out, but the 3 of us, since we're here, I'm going to have each of us have another 5 minutes.
But we ought to let Dr. Freihofer answer the question.
All right, answer that one. And then
since it's been so eloquently
Then we're going
posed.
to have another round just for those.
Is this tax going to have a chilling effect on you being able to do those tests?
Well, I think the tests that
Answer
you're
yes.
talking about would not necessarily be done in the doctor's offices. I think many of these diagnostic tests would probably be done by a laboratory.
Well, if I can interrupt you for a minute, that's exactly what we were told, that these would be point of diagnostic tests that would be done. The rapid strep was alluded to, and I tried to get some information on some of the others, but they'll be done in the office.
Well, they may be collected in the office, but in order to be done in the office, you have to be CLIA approved to perform that level of test. So certainly, I think some of these initial tests might not be performed in the office, and those are concerns. And certainly, as you say, there's a lot more work we need to do on this new health care bill. But I think there are a lot of things we did accomplish. I have children. I have college students, and I'm glad to know that they can stay on my health insurance until they're 26. I'm glad we've gotten rid of this pre-existing condition problem for so many of our patients. So there's some good things that happen, but we still have a lot of work to be done, and we're depending on you and Congress to work out the bugs, and including these bugs we've talked about today, and move forward to help our patients.
All right, now we're going to have you have another 5 minutes after myself, Shimkus, and you. All right. Okay. I wanted to ask the question of how we can promote the stewardship of antibiotics, encouraging more judicious use. You know, in our first hearing on antibiotics, we heard about the CDC's Get Smart campaign, which is an effort to educate physicians and encourage better prescribing habits. We heard about some of the successes of that venture and some of the shortfalls in the funding for it. But even if Get Smart were fully funded, I'm wondering if that goes far enough, especially if patients are demanding antibiotics. I'm worried that a volunteer campaign won't be able to effectively address this issue, or that even the interagency collaboration and what's proposed by Mr. Matheson under STAR might not be enough. So let me just ask three questions in this regard. First, of Dr. Bradley, because I don't think we've even asked you anything. As a pediatrician, can you talk about the pressures you face from parents to give antibiotics for your patients?
Yes, sir. In the past, that's been sort of standard. Both the parents ask for antibiotics for their children with sore throats, grandparents ask, and we've had a campaign with teaching materials in the waiting rooms, in the exam rooms, to say, don't ask for an antibiotic if your doctor doesn't think your child has an infection. There are programs we've put into place that have decreased antibiotic use, some of them CDC, some of them Academy of Pediatrics, and it's an education issue. And I think all of the press that the lay press has a lot of information about antibiotic resistance. Parents are now understanding that we can't just give antibiotics out. In another constructive way, in different medical groups, there are clinical pathways being developed where if a child has an ear infection, they come in with a supposed ear infection. There are specific ways that the doctor needs to evaluate that to make sure it's a true infection. So there's a little checklist. Is the eardrum red and bulging? Is there pain? Is there fever? And if not all of those are present, then there's no antibiotic that should be prescribed. We're putting together the same things for pneumonia, so that we're designing methods for physicians and clinicians to assess children in a systematic way to reduce inappropriate antibiotic use. So it's a huge problem, and we're working hard.
Address it.
We're not there.
All right. I wanted to ask. I only have 2 minutes. I wanted to get into the hospital setting because I can see how, these quality measures, like Dr. Freihofer, you mentioned better quality measures to track antibiotic use, and I can see how that would work, where someone has a cold or sinus and the antibiotics shouldn't be used. But what about quality measures in the hospital setting? I'll ask you, Dr. Freihofer, and then Dr. Spellberg. You laid out a comprehensive campaign for stewardship, and you talked about comprehensive hospital programs. So let me start with you. Same question. What do we do in the hospital setting? I'll ask you and then Dr. Spellberg.
Well, certainly the hospital setting is a much different setting than the ambulatory setting. In the hospital, there's an opportunity for a very collaborative approach with the primary care or admitting physician, with infectious disease specialist colleagues, with a clinical pharmacologist, also with the laboratory. So it's more of a real-time situation. So you can sort of change your approach to the patient, every hour, every minute, so to speak. In an ambulatory setting, right now, we don't have as many quick diagnostic ways to know exactly what the patient has when they come in the office. And I think all of us were very impressed by the photo of that young woman that you showed us at the end of your presentation, Dr. Spellberg. But as a primary care physician, seeing patients in my office every day, I don't want my patient to get like that. So we don't want every patient that gets an antibiotic to be on the verge of death. We want to use them judiciously. At the same time, we don't want to handcuff doctors because we're going to lose patients that way also.
Dr. Spellberg?
I have to answer your question in 3 parts, but I'll go quick. Okay, so there's 3 strategies for stewardship. There's nagging, which I'm going to make more comments about in a minute, and that's really important. There's diagnostics, and there's approving drugs through the FDA in a completely new way, and all 3 of these things need to be done. In terms of the nagging, which is the traditional antibiotic stewardship program, I just want to point out what we're up against. If you go back to the historical literature, which I spent a lot of time reading over the last several years, there were physicians in the 1940s that were begging their colleagues not to overprescribe antibiotics. This is not a new conversation. It is very difficult to change human behavior. Stewardship programs have generally not been widely disseminated because there's no mechanism to pay for them. Hospitals won't pay people to spend their time nagging people not to prescribe drugs. So one of the issues is we need the CDC to develop stewardship programs, and then we need to figure out how to convince medical systems to pay for their implementation. The second thing, probably the most powerful way we can prevent overuse of antibiotics, is exactly what was just mentioned. Look at the psychology of why antibiotics are overprescribed. It's fear. And I don't mean specific fear about lawsuits. I mean brainstem, we don't know why we're afraid fear, because we don't know which of our patients have bacterial infections or not. We have a patient with symptoms. It may be bacteria, it may be viruses. If 95% of the time it's viruses, it means 5% of the time it's bacteria, and I don't want to guess wrong. If we had rapid diagnostics, physicians have a printout that says this is not a bacterial infection. That will end inappropriate antibiotic prescriptions. So new diagnostics would be very powerful. And the third thing is new FDA indications. If a drug is only indicated for the treatment of multi-drug resistant bacteria, it can only be marketed by law for what it's indicated for. That will prevent overuse of the drug in other settings.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Shimkus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, first of all, I've been told, and I believe, although obviously you've heard me address some misgivings, that FDA has historically been the gold standard, and it's been able to help and roll out things. Obviously, there's hiccups and there's problems now that we really want to address. There's also a concern in the pharmaceutical debate, just in essence, regular chemical compound drugs and maybe in biologics, that the new European Union and their pathway might eventually incentivize and have a quicker pathway, which not only then moves new drugs and disease and development over in the European, but then the factories and the jobs, and then we lose that gold standard. Now we're talking about this a continued problem here now with the antibiotic issue, and you're all the experts, and maybe Dr. Levy, maybe Dr. Spielberg, Dr. Bradley, someone who are nodding as I was looking facial expressions. Anyone want to weigh in? Is this European Union takeover, their ability to have a quicker pathway? Is that a real threat? Two, is there stuff that we can learn in their processes which might help us move rapidly? Can anyone?
I will make a couple of comments, and then I suggest that Dr. Eisenstein may be the most qualified to answer this.
Dr. Bradley wants to answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I can tell you that the way that the EMEA is approving antibiotics now includes strong programs for pediatrics up front. So after the first phase 1 trials where the drugs preliminarily tested in adults, they're now beginning to get testing in children so that they'll have drugs for their children probably 5 years or so sooner than we would have them in the United States. Our FDA is talking to them, and I hope that we can get earlier programs in pediatrics. But yes, the EMEA and the Europeans have come at this with a completely fresh view, and they're rattling cages, and some of their ideas are quite good. Thank you.
Dr. Eisenstein?
Yes, we get the impression, as Dr. Bradley just stated, that the EMA is moving ahead in a more forward-looking way. I think that, unfortunately, the FDA had a hiccup with the approval process with Ketek. That's been very well documented. I won't go into details. But unfortunately, they, I believe, have gone into more of a risk-averse mode over the last 4 or 5 years. And one of my favorite expressions I learned from the director of infectious diseases at the time, Janice Sareth, let's not have the perfect be the enemy of the good. And unfortunately, Janice is no longer at that position anymore, in part because of the fallout from Ketek, and it was, I think, very unfortunate.
Dr. Levy?
I guess the two things that I would add is, one, I think we do have something to learn from how the Europeans are doing overall drug approval. But I also think that sometimes we are You know, we need to recognize that in the United States, for example, when we want the FDA process to move quickly, it can. We had the first approved H1N1 vaccines in the United States, even though our system is allegedly so much more cumbersome. So I think when we want to, we can make that system work. But the second is we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not just, you know, the fact that there are so few new molecular entities entering the FDA stream is not because exclusively and probably not primarily because of the FDA approval process, because we don't have the intellectual capital up front to create those, and we need to be investing in creating that intellectual capital, and then maybe some of the financial capital will follow.
Yeah, let me just finish with this. I think a couple things. I agree with you, Dr. Levy. The bioterrorism response that we did a couple Congresses ago, and BARDA is an example of us when we realize that there's a real need to move, we can move. There's probably things to be learned in that process that would help us. I am concerned about the European Union and their ability to usurp us if we don't straighten out our processes to some extent. And this risk issue, the perfect and the enemy of the good, is something that I think we just have to be careful. I go back to the drug, the last drug, everything else is not of use. You go back to the drug developed in the 60s that was super toxicity, but if I was the parent and that was last hope, that also brings in liability issues. There are processes, as I talked when Mr. Matheson was here, I think there are processes that good members of goodwill can get some compromise on to move this forward, and I do appreciate the testimony today.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Levy, you're right. We did get that vaccine out, H1N1 vaccine out in very, very short time, and the vaccine produced in this country turned out to be much safer than the vaccine produced in particularly some of the Eastern European countries. So, yeah, I'll be the first to criticize the FDA, and I'm fixing to do it a little bit more. But I did want to point out that, yeah, they do sometimes do things right, and we do take safety in this country. We just stipulate that drugs are always going to be safe. But Dr. Eisenstein, you're right. We just clobbered them over Key-Tech. We had them in here every day for what it seemed like for weeks on end, and it was a wonder that there was anyone left standing at the FDA. It wasn't this committee, but the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee that I'm also on was really pretty aggressive on that. Not that there weren't problems, but I think you're right. I think we as a subcommittee probably bear some of that responsibility because of the punishment we extracted on the folks at the FDA after that Key-Tech story broke. Let me just ask you, Dr. Eisenstein, on the issue. I talked to Dr. Spellerberg about this a little bit, but the antibiotics in the pipeline concept. Do we have some good molecules in the pipeline that are going to be coming forward?
I can speak mostly about Cubist. We are focused on acute health care. We have most of our expertise in the anti-infective space. We've now had daptomycin, Cubicin on the market for 7 years to specifically fight MRSA. And with that head of steam that we've established, we have 3 additional antimicrobials that are in human testing. One of them is for a disease called Clostridium difficile associated diarrhea. You're a physician. You understand the importance of that. What others might not appreciate is that is starting to come up on the horizon to become even as important perhaps as MRSA is in the hospital setting. We are working on an antimicrobial specifically for that. We recently acquired a small company, an even smaller company than ours because we consider ourselves a mid-cap company, looking at a new molecule to go after one of the 6 key escape pathogens, in this case Pseudomonas, through a new mechanism of action that we're very excited about. And we have yet another antibiotic also in the clinic that goes after some of the other escape pathogens, including Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, and Klebsiella. Let me underscore, though, something that Dr. Spelberg just said earlier, and that is it is very difficult to be able to develop antimicrobials specifically for drug-resistant organisms, because by definition, you don't have anything to compare it with. So you therefore can't do a controlled clinical trial. This is exactly the comment made earlier about the statistics getting in the way of clinical judgment that makes otherwise great sense.
Let me just ask you a question on that. So some of the so-called market failures aren't really caused by a failure of science. They're caused more by the difficulties that we impose in the regulatory process?
I would say that's part of it, and the other part is that then the market size later, given the constraints that we have, of putting some of these, I would say, enormously potentially valuable antibiotics. We talked some about personal interaction. I have a granddaughter who's been, because of birth defects at birth, she's 3 years old now, she's been through 6 urinary tract infections, 3 of which have been caused by these escape pathogens. I worry every moment that the next infection she's going to get is going to be due to an organism that's going to not allow her to live anymore. I mean, I am very personally invested in this. But the difficulty then is that we have the opportunity to come up with the new antibiotics, but then they have to be put behind a glass plate that says crack only in case of an emergency.
Yeah, and I'm going to interrupt you there because I'm running out of time. And Dr. Spellberg, you referenced that, and you said use only as indicated. But I mean, doctors, we use stuff off-label all the time.
What we're talking about is a total rethink of how antibiotics are developed in this country and throughout the world. We can no longer afford the luxury of having a drug like tigecycline come out, which is a life-saving drug for people with really resistant Acinetobacter, and then have it get FDA approved to treat skin infections where we have 20 other antibiotics we can be using.
Good point.
We have to change the way we do things.
I just want to ask you one last question on the advisory panels, because this is a fight that the chairman and I had 3 years ago during the reauthorization of the Food and Drug Act. And you talked for some philosophical flexibility in the advisory panels. We restricted the advisory panels such that anyone who'd actually worked on development of a compound was restricted off of the panel. And this seemed to me to be awfully short-sighted. The Institute of Medicine, in fact, I think, said restrict it to no more than 25%. But the way we went about that seemed awfully pernicious, particularly in the fields, some of the pediatric fields. The universe of people that's worked on the compound is I mean, they're the people who know, the only people who know about the drug. So is what we've done with the advisory panels in the reauthorization 3 years ago, has that been part of the problem?
Well, in my opinion, I think the advisory panels have done the best they can overall. The real dissension recently has been a true clinician-statistician split. Not a overall scientific split, although I do agree with you that I think that the people who are the most experienced with clinical investigations are the people who tend to get consulted by companies. So, if you exclude the most experienced, informed people, it does create problems. And, Dr. Bradley has spent a lot of time in the advisory committee, so I wonder if you want to make some comments.
I thank you for your comments, sir, and I believe that keeping people off the committee who have any experience in developing the drugs has been a problem.
Thank both of you. I'm glad the chairman was here to hear that. I'll yield back my.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, this has been very helpful, obviously, and I think we learned a lot today. And again, we're doing 3 hearings and an ongoing effort, and then we may move some legislation. So I really appreciate your input. We may give you additional written questions within the next 10 days or so, and then we'd like you to get back to us promptly with that. But thank you again, and without objection, the meeting of the subcommittee is adjourned.